Welcome, dear friends, to a quiet evening together. Tonight, we're going to wander through the rich story of Ohio's history, letting the gentle flow of time carry us from ancient mysteries to modern wonders. Picture yourself settling into your favorite comfortable chair, maybe with a warm cup of tea nearby, as we set out on this peaceful journey through the Buckeye State's remarkable story. Ohio has always been a place where different worlds come together, long before it had a name, before lines were drawn on maps. This land held civilizations that built monuments pointing to the stars and carved stories into the earth itself. Tonight, we'll explore how native peoples shaped valleys that would later echo with the sounds of canal boats, how ancient mounds gave way to busy cities, and how a territory on the edge of the wilderness became the heartland of a growing nation. Before we begin, I'd really like to know something. If you actually live in the USA, which state are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Maybe you actually live in Ohio, and the history of your home state means a great deal to your life. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. The first peoples. The story begins not with settlements or statehood, but with footprints pressed into soft ground thousands of years ago, when the first people followed herds across lands still recovering from melting ice. Can you imagine what Ohio looked like back then? Huge prairies spread out between thick forests, while rivers ran wild and free, cutting new paths with each spring flood. The mastodons had only recently vanished, leaving behind bones that would puzzle future generations, and the climate was slowly warming into the patterns we know today. These earliest people, whom archaeologists call Paleoindians, arrived perhaps 13,000 years ago, bringing with them knowledge passed down through countless generations. They knew which stones made the sharpest spear points, which plants could heal or harm, and how to read the subtle signs that showed where animals might be found. Their campsites scattered across what would become Ohio tell us stories of careful survival in a changing world. Picture a small group moving through the Scioto Valley on a crisp autumn morning. The leader stops at a familiar rock outcrop of flint, running worn fingers over the stone. This isn't just any rock, it's Ohio's famous Flint Ridge material, prized for its quality and destined to be traded hundreds of miles away. The skill needed to shape these stones into tools was remarkable. Each piece had to be struck with perfect accuracy, and the finished spear points were works of art as much as tools for survival. As centuries went by, these wandering hunters slowly adapted to a more settled way of life. The large herds they had followed were gone, but the warming climate brought new chances. Rivers filled with fish, forests held deer and smaller game, and the valleys offered nuts, berries, and roots in plenty. Why follow herds across endless plains, when everything needed for a good life could be found within a day's walk? This shift toward what archaeologists call the Archaic period brought deep changes. Villages began to appear along riverbanks, not just the temporary camps of their ancestors, but real settlements, where families might return season after season. The people learned to hollow out trees for canoes, to make nets for fishing, and to grind nuts and seeds with stone tools. They discovered that certain wild plants could be helped to grow larger and more plentiful with careful tending. The first small steps toward farming. But perhaps most remarkably, they started to think about death in new ways. Instead of simply leaving their dead behind as wandering peoples might, these settlers began creating special places for burial, places that would become sacred to their communities for generations. The dead were laid to rest with their most valued belongings, ornaments and tools that would go with them on whatever journey lay ahead. The Adena mound builders. These burial practices would eventually grow into something truly extraordinary. Around 700 BCE, a culture emerged in Ohio that would leave a lasting mark on the land. The Adena people, named after an estate in Chillicothe, where their remains were first studied, took the burial traditions of their ancestors and turned them into something magnificent. They began building mounds, not simple graves, but earth monuments that rose like gentle hills above the Ohio countryside. These weren't quickly made. Each Adena mound represented months or years of careful work, with entire communities carrying basket loads of earth to create these monuments to their dead. The largest mounds reached heights of 60 feet or more, requiring the moving of thousands of tons of soil. But why put such effort into honoring the dead? What drove these people to reshape the very land for their ancestors? The answer lies partly in their growing complexity as a society. The Adena people had moved well beyond just surviving. Their villages supported artists who created beautiful ornaments from copper, carved detailed designs into stone tablets, and fashioned fancy headdresses from antlers and feathers. They had built trade networks that brought exotic materials from faraway places, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and copper from the shores of Lake Superior. But the mounds weren't just about showing off wealth or status. What archaeologists have found suggests they served as gathering places for complex ceremonies, spots where the living could connect with their ancestors and with the spirits that guided their world. Many mounds were built in stages with new layers added over time as the community's understanding of the sacred grew and changed. Standing beside one of these ancient mounds today, maybe the famous Grave Creek Mound in nearby West Virginia or the Adena Mound in you can almost feel the weight of centuries pressing down. How many generations worked to create these monuments? How many ceremonies took place on their slopes? What songs were sung? What stories told as the community came together to honor their dead and celebrate their bond with the land? The Hopewell legacy. The Adena culture flourished for nearly 1,000 years. But around 200 BCE, their mound building traditions began to grow into something even more remarkable. A new culture was emerging, one that would turn Ohio into the ceremonial heart of ancient North America. The Hopewell people, named after the Ohio farm where their artifacts were first found, took the Adena fascination with earthworks and raised it to an art form that still amazes archaeologists today. Where the Adena built mounds, the Hopewell built geometric wonders. Massive earth circles, precise squares, and complex polygons began appearing across the Ohio landscape. Each construction needed careful planning and deep knowledge of math and astronomy. These weren't random shapes scattered across the countryside. They were parts of vast ceremonial complexes that could cover thousands of acres. The most famous of these sites, the Newark Earthworks, once spread across 4 square miles of central Ohio. Picture trying to grasp its original size. A great circle nearly 1,200 feet in diameter connected by parallel walls to a perfect octagon, with additional earthworks stretching in many directions. The accuracy is amazing. Modern surveys have shown that these earthworks were laid out with a precision that wouldn't be matched by European surveyors for more than 1,000 years. But how did they do it? The Hopewell people had no written language, no metal tools, no work animals to help with construction. They worked with wooden digging sticks and stone tools, carrying countless baskets of earth to create walls that rose 12 feet high in some places. The level of organization required is mind-boggling. Thousands of people must have worked together over many years, all guided by a shared vision of what they were creating. Recent archaeological work has revealed that these geometric earthworks weren't built randomly. Many line up with important astronomical events, the rising and setting points of the moon during its 18th, 6-year cycle, the solstices and equinoxes that marked the changing seasons. The Hopewell people had become skilled astronomers, building their knowledge of the skies into monuments made from earth and stone. Think about what this means. These ancient Ohioans were tracking the movements of heavenly bodies with amazing accuracy, passing astronomical knowledge from generation to generation, and creating lasting markers that would let future observers predict eclipses and other sky events. They had turned Ohio into a huge calendar, a three-dimensional record of their understanding of the universe. The Hopewell trade networks were just as impressive. Artifacts found in Ohio mounds include copper from Michigan's Upper Peninsula, obsidian from Yellowstone, shells from both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, and mica from the southern Appalachians. These weren't simple trading deals. They were complex cultural exchanges that spread Hopewell influence across half the continent. Ideas, artistic styles, and religious practices flowed along these trade routes just as surely as rare materials. What drove this amazing flowering of culture? Some archaeologists think the Hopewell people had developed a form of ancestor worship that needed more and more elaborate ceremonies and monuments. Others suggest they were responding to population growth and the need to keep alliances between different groups. Maybe both explanations have some truth. Whatever the cause, the result was a civilization that created some of the most sophisticated earthworks in human history. The Hopewell people also left behind artifacts of stunning beauty and complexity. Copper ornaments shaped like birds and serpents, stone pipes carved with detailed animal figures, and fancy headdresses decorated with freshwater pearls and colorful feathers. These weren't just useful objects. They were works of art that reflected a rich world of symbols we can only partly understand today. Many of these artifacts were found in burial mounds where they went with the dead into the afterlife. But Hopewell burials show interesting social differences. Some people were buried with huge amounts of rare grave goods, while others received simpler treatment. This suggests that Hopewell society had developed complex rankings, with certain people, maybe priests or chiefs, holding special status in their communities. The Hopewell culture reached its peak around 200 CE, but by 400 CE, their great earthworks were mostly abandoned. The reasons for this decline remain a mystery. Climate change might have disrupted their farming, or maybe the complex trade networks that supported their civilization became too hard to keep going. Some scholars suggest that the very success of Hopewell culture led to its downfall as growing populations placed too much demand on local resources. Whatever the cause, the Hopewell decline marked the end of Ohio's first golden age of monumental building. But their legacy lived on in the earthworks that still dot the landscape, and in the traditions that would inspire later generations of mound builders. The geometric precision of their constructions and the sophistication of their ties to the stars represent achievements that weren't equaled in North America until European surveying methods arrived more than 1,000 years later. Serpent in the Earth. All the remarkable earthworks left by Ohio's ancient peoples. None captures the imagination quite like the Great Serpent Mound. Curving across a hilltop in Adams County, this huge, snake-shaped mound stretches nearly 1,300 feet in length. Its winding form follows the natural shape of the ridge. From the air, it clearly looks like an enormous serpent, its mouth wide open, appearing to swallow an oval object that might represent an egg or the sun. Standing at the serpent's tail, on a quiet evening, you can walk along its whole length, marveling at the skill needed to create such a huge and exact form. The mound averages about 3 feet in height and 20 feet in width. But these modest numbers hide the enormous effort required for its building. Thousands of tons of earth and stone had to be carefully shaped and placed to create the serpent's graceful curves. Who built this remarkable monument? The question has puzzled archaeologists for more than 100 years. Unlike burial mounds, Serpent Mound contains no artifacts or human remains that might reveal its creator's identity. Some evidence suggests it was built by the Adena people around 300 BCE, while other research points to the later Fort Ancient culture around 1070 CE. Maybe both groups helped build it, with later peoples adding to or changing an ancient design. The serpent's purpose remains just as mysterious. Some scholars believe it served as a huge calendar, with various curves and alignments marking important astronomical events. The head appears to point toward the summer solstice sunset, while other parts of the body may match different sky observations. If this understanding is correct, Serpent Mound is another example of ancient Ohioans building their astronomical knowledge into the land itself. Others see the serpent as a picture of important spiritual beliefs. Many Native American cultures view snakes as powerful spirit beings tied to water, fertility, and the underworld. The act of creating such a huge snake shape might have been a form of prayer or offering, a way of honoring these spiritual forces and asking for their continued favor. The oval shape near the serpent's head has sparked much debate. Is it an egg representing creation and growth? The sun being swallowed during an eclipse? A frog, another important figure in Native American stories. Each explanation opens new possibilities for understanding the monument's meaning and importance. What makes Serpent Mound even more remarkable is its setting. The builders chose a spot on a ridge overlooking Bush Creek, placing their creation to be visible from many viewpoints in the surrounding valley. They also built it on what geologists now recognize as the edge of an ancient meteor crater, adding another layer of mystery to an already puzzling monument. Recent efforts to protect it have helped preserve this ancient wonder for future generations. The surrounding land has been protected as a state memorial, making sure that visitors can still feel the awe that must have been felt by its creators more than 1,000 years ago. Walking along the serpent's length at sunset, watching the shadows shift and change across its ancient curves, you can't help but feel connected to the people who shaped this earth so long ago. The mystery of Serpent Mound reminds us how much we still don't know about Ohio's ancient past. Despite more than a century of digging and study, these early peoples keep their secrets well. Their earthworks remain, but their voices have been silenced by time. We can study their artifacts, measure their monuments, and guess about their purposes, but the full richness of their cultures stays just out of reach. The sense of mystery extends to many other Ohio earthworks. The octagon at Newark was clearly designed with the stars in mind, but what ceremonies took place inside its walls? The huge circle at Circleville, now mostly destroyed by city growth, once covered more than 20 acres, but what gatherings did it hold? Each earthwork raises more questions than it answers, leaving us to imagine the rich ceremonial life that once flourished in ancient Ohio. The Fort Ancient culture as the Hopewell culture faded, Ohio didn't become empty or deserted. Instead, new peoples moved in, bringing different traditions and ways of life. Around 1000 CE, a culture archaeologists call Fort Ancient began building villages throughout the Ohio River Valley. These people took their name from a hillside earthwork near Lebanon, Ohio, where they built one of their most impressive settlements. The Fort Ancient people represented a major change from those who came before. Where the Hopewell had focused on building ceremonial monuments, the Fort Ancient people were more concerned with everyday matters of daily life. They built protected villages on hilltops and river terraces, put up sturdy houses from wood and thatch, and developed advanced farming systems based on corn, beans, and squash. This shift toward farming had deep effects. For the first time in Ohio's history, large numbers of people could be supported in fairly small areas. Villages might hold several hundred people, all depending on the crops growing in nearby fields. This concentration of people encouraged new forms of social organization, skilled craft work, and cultural expression. Fort Ancient pottery shows a remarkable artistic skill. Their pots were decorated with detailed patterns, stylized animal figures, and complex geometric designs. Some pots were clearly meant for ceremonies, too fancy and fragile for daily use, suggesting that art and religion stayed important parts of their culture even as practical concerns shaped their daily lives. These people also developed new burial practices that reflected their farming lifestyle. Instead of building huge mounds like their predecessors, they usually buried their dead in village cemeteries, often placing them in large storage pits that had been used for keeping corn. This practice suggests a deep connection between death, new life, and the farming cycle that supported their communities. The Fort Ancient people weren't cut off from the wider world. What archaeologists have found shows trade connections stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Seashells, copper ornaments, and unusual stone tools found in Ohio villages show that exchange networks continued, though maybe not as far-reaching as those the Hopewell had kept up centuries earlier. One of the most interesting aspects of Fort Ancient culture was their apparent interest in sky events. Several of their earthworks appear to line up with astronomical happenings, continuing Ohio's ancient tradition of monument building sky watchers. The Fort Ancient earthwork itself may have worked as an observatory, with its walls and gateways placed to frame important rising and setting points of the sun and moon. Climate change may have played a part in shaping Fort Ancient culture. The medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250 CE, brought good growing conditions that supported larger populations and more complex societies throughout much of North America. The corn-based farming that sustained Fort Ancient villages would have thrived during these centuries of reliable rain and longer growing seasons. But around 1450 CE, the Fort Ancient culture began to fade. Villages were left behind, population centers shifted, and what archaeologists find becomes much sparser. The reasons for this decline matched those that affected many other North American societies during this time. Climate change, specifically the start of the Little Ice Age, may have made farming less reliable. Fighting and disease could have broken up settled communities. Or maybe the arrival of new peoples from other areas forced existing populations to change or move. By the time European explorers first entered Ohio in the late 1600s, the Fort Ancient culture had vanished, leaving behind only their earthworks and artifacts to puzzle future generations. Their disappearance marked the end of the prehistoric period in Ohio and set the stage for a new chapter in the region's history. The land of many nations, the Ohio that European explorers found in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was not an empty wilderness, despite what some history books might suggest. Instead, it was a land claimed and used by many Native American nations whose territories overlapped and shifted with the changing fortunes of war, diplomacy, and trade. The Shawnee people, whose name means Southerners in their Algonquian language, were perhaps the most prominent residents of central Ohio during this time. They had moved north from the southeast, pushed by conflicts with other tribes and the growing presence of European settlers. Ohio's river valleys gave them excellent hunting grounds and fertile soil for their crops of corn, beans, and squash. Shawnee villages dotted the landscape along major rivers like the Scioto and the Miami. These weren't permanent settlements in the European sense, but rather seasonal centers that might be lived in for several years before the community moved to fresh hunting grounds or more easily defended positions. The Shawnee were skilled warriors and diplomats, keeping up complex relationships with neighboring tribes and the growing number of European traders who came into Ohio. The Miami people controlled much of western Ohio, Their villages were concentrated along the river that bears their name today. They had developed an advanced farming system that supported fairly large populations, and their villages often included large council houses where important decisions were made and ceremonies held. The Miami were known throughout the region for their diplomatic skills and their ability to form alliances that protected their interests. In eastern Ohio, the Delaware or Lenape people had set up communities after being forced from their original homeland in the mid-Atlantic region. Their move west was part of a larger pattern of population movement caused by European expansion along the Atlantic coast. The Delaware brought with them wide experience in dealing with Europeans, knowledge that made them valuable allies and tough opponents. These three major nations, along with smaller groups like the Wyandot, Ottawa, and Mingo, turned Ohio into a complex political landscape. Villages served not just as places to live, but as meeting places where representatives from different nations could gather to work out treaties, arrange marriages, and plan military campaigns. The famous council fires that burned in villages like Piqua and Chillicothe drew delegates from across the eastern woodlands. The arrival of European trade goods had already begun to change Native American life in Ohio well before permanent European settlements appeared. Metal tools, guns, cloth, and alcohol flowed into Ohio villages along trade routes that stretched back to French posts on the Great Lakes and British settlements along the Atlantic coast. In return, Ohio's people provided furs, especially beaver pelts, that were in high demand in European markets. This trade brought both opportunities and problems. Metal knives and hatchets were better than stone tools, and guns gave warriors big advantages in battle. But depending on European goods also made Native American communities open to disruption. If trade routes were blocked, or if European allies proved unreliable, whole ways of life could be threatened. The introduction of alcohol created social problems that traditional leaders struggled to handle. European diseases proved even more devastating than trade disruptions. Smallpox, measles, and other sicknesses swept through Ohio's Native American communities again and again throughout the 18th century. These diseases were especially deadly because Native Americans had no previous exposure and therefore no natural protection. Whole villages might be wiped out in a matter of weeks, leaving survivors to rebuild their communities from scattered remnants. The impact of these epidemics went far beyond the immediate loss of life. Traditional knowledge disappeared when elders died. Political structures collapsed when leaders gave in to disease, and social networks that had taken generations to build were broken overnight. The survivors faced the huge challenge of rebuilding their cultures while also dealing with growing pressure from European expansion. Despite these challenges, Ohio's Native American people proved remarkably strong and adaptable. They formed new alliances that crossed traditional tribal lines, developed creative military tactics that took advantage of Ohio's varied landscape, and created diplomatic strategies that played European powers against each other. Leaders like the Shawnee Chief Cornstalk and the Miami War Chief Little Turtle became legendary for their skill in both warfare and negotiation. The struggle for control of Ohio grew more intense as European colonial powers expanded their territorial claims. France claimed the region as part of New France, basing this claim on the explorations of Robert de La Salle and other French voyagers who had traveled down the Ohio River in the late 1600s. Britain argued back with claims based on their colonial charters, which gave some colonies territory stretching all the way to the South Sea or Pacific Ocean. These competing European claims meant little to Ohio's Native American people, who had their own well-established territorial boundaries and diplomatic relationships. But the rivalry between France and Britain for control of the Ohio Country, as Europeans called the region, would soon pull Native American nations into conflicts that would reshape the whole eastern half of the continent. French traders and missionaries were generally the first Europeans that Ohio's Native Americans met. The French way of colonizing emphasized trade and alliance rather than large-scale settlement, making them natural partners for Native American communities who wanted access to European goods without losing control of their lands. French trading posts like Detroit and Fort Miami became important centers where European and Native American cultures met and mixed. British traders offered some advantages over their French rivals, particularly in the quality and price of manufactured goods. British cloth was often better than French products, and British merchants could usually offer better prices for furs and other trade items. But British colonial policy was more focused on farming settlement, making them potential competitors for land, rather than simply trading partners. The competition between France and Britain for influence in Ohio came to a head during the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. This conflict, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, was fought largely over control of the Ohio River Valley and the vast territories beyond. Native American nations found themselves forced to choose sides, with most initially supporting the French, who seemed less threatening to their way of life. The war brought European military forces into Ohio for the first time in large numbers. Fort Duquesne, built by the French at the forks of the Ohio River, present-day Pittsburgh, became a central point for military operations throughout the region. British forces under General Edward Braddock suffered a terrible defeat near this fort in 1755, with Ohio's Native American allies playing a key role in the victory. But British resources finally proved decisive. The capture of Fort Duquesne in 1758, renamed Fort Pitt in honor of the British Prime Minister, marked the beginning of the end for French power in Ohio. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formally gave all of New France, including Ohio, to British control, fundamentally changing the balance of power in the region. The end of French rule left Ohio's Native American people in a risky position. Their former allies were gone, replaced by British administrators who showed little understanding of or respect for traditional Native American diplomatic ways. British military commanders like Jeffrey Amherst viewed Native Americans as obstacles to be removed rather than allies to be valued, leading to growing tensions throughout the region. These tensions exploded into violence in 1763 with the start of Pontiac's Rebellion, named after the Ottawa war chief who helped organize a coordinated attack on British posts throughout the Great Lakes region. Ohio played a key role in this conflict, with Native American forces surrounding British forts and attacking settlements throughout the area. The rebellion showed that European control of Ohio remained shaky despite their military victories. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III in response to Pontiac's rebellion, tried to calm tensions by forbidding British settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This proclamation recognized Native American land rights and set up procedures for future land purchases. But it also frustrated British colonists who had expected to benefit from the taking of French territories. The proclamation line, as it came to be known, proved impossible to enforce. British colonists kept crossing the mountains in search of new lands, often ignoring official bans and established Native American claims. These unauthorized settlements created a constant source of tension that would eventually help bring on the American Revolution. Ohio thus became a borderland in many ways. It marked the line between European and Native American control, between official British policy and colonial practice, and increasingly, between the interests of the British government and those of its American subjects. The stage was set for the conflicts that would finally decide who would control this rich and strategically important region. The Northwest Territory. The American Revolution turned Ohio from a far-off borderland into a key place of conflict. The fight that began as a dispute between Britain and its Atlantic coast colonies quickly spread west, pulling Ohio's Native American people into a struggle that would decide the future of the whole region. Most Ohio tribes first sided with the British, a choice that made strategic sense given what they had been through. British officials had at least in name recognized Native American land rights through the Proclamation of 1763, while American colonists had shown little respect for existing tribal boundaries. British agents gave weapons, supplies, and diplomatic help that helped Native American communities defend their homelands against American expansion. The war in Ohio was marked by raids, small fights, and sieges, rather than big battles. Native American warriors, often joined by British Rangers or Loyalist fighters, struck at American settlements and military posts throughout the region. These attacks forced American defenders to spread their forces thin and created a climate of constant danger that made it hard to set up permanent settlements. One of the most important early fights was the siege of Fort Henry, present-day Wheeling, West Virginia, in Kasaributu-Juratus, though technically outside Ohio's current borders. This attack showed how open American positions along the Ohio River were and inspired similar raids throughout the region. The defense of Fort Henry became legendary in frontier stories, particularly the role played by women like Betty Zane, who risked her life to bring gunpowder to the fort's defenders. American strategy in Ohio focused on setting up fortified positions along major rivers and trying to break the alliance between Britain and Native American nations. Forts were built at key spots like the mouth of the Great Miami River and along the portages that connected different river systems. These forts served as bases for military operations and as safe places for settlers running from Native American attacks. The most ambitious American operation in Ohio during the Revolution was George Rogers Clark's Illinois campaign of 1778 to 1779. Though Clark's main targets were British posts in present-day Illinois and Indiana, his success in capturing Vincennes and other key positions helped secure American control of the Ohio River and broke up British supply lines to their Native American allies. Clark's victories also showed American determination to challenge British control of the western lands. His small force of Virginia militiamen covered hundreds of miles through rough country, often in harsh winter conditions, to strike at British positions that seemed safely beyond American reach. The psychological impact of these successes was as important as their military meaning. Native American leaders like Joseph Brant of the Mohawks and Alexander McKee, a British agent of mixed Native American and European background, worked to coordinate resistance to American expansion. They organized alliances that brought together warriors from many tribes and helped plan joint operations against American targets. These alliances showed the continuing strength and sophistication of Native American political leadership despite the pressures of war. The war also saw the start of new forms of frontier fighting that would mark conflicts in Ohio for decades to come. Both sides used tactics that blurred the lines between military operations and terrorism, attacking not just enemy soldiers but also civilian communities that supported the other side. Scalping, torture, and the destruction of crops and buildings became common practices that scarred whole communities. American forces answered Native American raids with punishing trips designed to destroy villages and food supplies. These operations, such as the Crawford Expedition of 1782, often failed to catch their intended targets, but succeeded in making the cycle of violence worse throughout the region. The brutal execution of Colonel William Crawford by his Native American captors became a rallying cry for American settlers, and a symbol of the savagery they associated with frontier warfare. The Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ended the American Revolution, had deep effects on Ohio. Britain recognized American independence and gave up all land east of the Mississippi River to the new United States, including Ohio. But the treaty made no rules for the Native American nations that had controlled this territory for generations, basically treating them as unimportant in the diplomatic settlement. This oversight created immediate problems for American leaders. The United States claimed ownership of Ohio by right of conquest and transfer from Britain. But the actual people of the region, Ohio's Native American nations, had not been defeated and showed no desire to leave their homelands willingly. The stage was set for another round of conflicts that would decide who would actually control Ohio's fertile valleys and rich resources. The end of the Revolution also brought new pressures for westward expansion. American veterans had been promised land grants in return for their military service, and thousands of settlers were eager to take advantage of new opportunities beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Ohio, with its rich soil and river connections, beckoned as a promised land for these would-be pioneers. But first, the new American government had to figure out how to organize and run these western lands. The Articles of Confederation gave little guidance for territorial management, and the individual states had competing claims to western lands based on their colonial charters. Virginia claimed much of present-day Ohio based on its 1609 charter, while Connecticut claimed the Western Reserve based on its charter grants. These competing state claims had to be settled before Ohio could be properly organized and settled. The solution came through a series of land cessions in which states gave up their western territorial claims to the federal government in exchange for various considerations. Virginia's cession in 1784 was particularly important as it included most of present-day Ohio, though the state kept the right to use land in Kentucky to satisfy military bounties promised to its Revolutionary War veterans. Connecticut's cession was more complicated as the state first kept a large area in northeastern Ohio known as the Western Reserve. This area stayed under Connecticut's control until 1800, creating a mix of different government systems within Ohio. The Connecticut Land Company, which bought the Western Reserve from the state, set up its own system of land surveying and settlement that differed a lot from federal practices elsewhere in Ohio. The settlement of state territorial claims cleared the way for federal action to organize the western lands. The Land Ordinance of 1785 set up the rectangular survey system that would be used to divide Ohio into townships and sections, creating the grid pattern of roads and property lines that still marks much of the Midwest today. This system was far more orderly than the meets and bounds surveys used in the original states and helped prevent the border disputes that had troubled earlier settlements. Even more important was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which set up the legal and political rules for governing the territory that included Ohio. This ordinance guaranteed certain basic rights to territorial residents, including freedom of religion, trial by jury, and protection from cruel and unusual punishment. It also banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, making Ohio and its neighboring territories free from the start of American settlement. The Northwest Ordinance also set up a process by which territories could become states. When a territory's population reached 60,000 free people, it could ask for statehood on equal terms with the original states. This rule made sure that Western territories would not remain permanent colonies but would eventually become full partners in the American Union. Arthur St. Clair was appointed as the first territorial governor of the Northwest Territory in 1788, taking up residence in Marietta, Ohio's first permanent American settlement. Clair faced huge challenges in setting up American authority in a region where Native American nations stayed in effective control of most of the land. His administration was slowed by limited resources, conflicting orders from federal officials, and the constant threat of violence along the frontier. The building of American settlements in Ohio went slowly at first, with most early communities located along major rivers where supplies could be brought in and evacuations carried out if needed. Marietta, founded by the Ohio Company of Associates in 1788, was typical of these early settlements in its defensive layout and its dependence on outside help for survival. The Ohio Company had bought a large area of land in southeastern Ohio from the federal government, paying partly in continental currency that had lost much of its value since the Revolution. This arrangement let the company get nearly 1 million acres at extremely good terms. But it also meant that the company's investors, many of whom were Revolutionary War veterans, had to succeed in setting up profitable settlements or lose their life savings. Marietta's founders chose their location carefully, placing their settlement where the Muskingum and Ohio rivers meet, where ancient mounds, built by earlier people, gave high spots for defenses. They laid out their town with a central fortified area, surrounded by outlying farms and settlements, a pattern that showed both their military backgrounds and their awareness of the continuing threats from hostile Native American forces. Cincinnati, originally called Losantiville, was founded in 1788 by John Cleave Sims and his partners. Sims had bought a large area of land between the Miami and Little Miami rivers, hoping to set up a series of prosperous farming settlements. The location offered excellent access to the Ohio River and good farmland, but it also placed the settlement directly in the path of Native American raiding parties coming from villages farther north. These early settlements struggled to establish themselves in the face of constant military threats. Native American forces, often backed by British agents operating from posts in present-day Michigan and Ontario, launched repeated attacks on American settlements throughout Ohio. The situation was made more complicated by the fact that Britain had not left its western military posts as required by the Treaty of Paris, keeping a presence that encouraged Native American resistance to American expansion. The failure of American diplomacy to settle these tensions peacefully led to military action. General Josiah Harmer led the first major American expedition against Native American villages in Ohio in 1790, but his poorly trained and equipped forces suffered major defeats near present-day Fort Wayne, Indiana. The failure of Harmer's expedition encouraged more Native American attacks and showed that American control of Ohio remained mostly a theory. An even more ambitious expedition under General Arthur St. Clair met with complete disaster in 1791. St. Clair's force of nearly 1,400 men was surprised and routed by a Native American alliance led by chiefs like Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee. More than 600 American soldiers were killed in what became known as St. Clair's defeat, making it one of the worst military disasters in American history. The size of this defeat sent shockwaves throughout the United States and forced a complete rethinking of American policy toward Ohio's Native American people. President George Washington and his advisors realized that half-hearted military efforts would not succeed in setting up American control over Ohio. A more serious commitment of resources and leadership would be needed to reach their territorial goals. The task of restoring American military reputation and setting up effective control over Ohio fell to General Anthony Wayne, a Revolutionary War veteran known for his aggressive tactics and careful planning. Wayne spent nearly 2 years training and organizing the Legion of the United States, a new military force designed specifically for frontier fighting. Unlike his predecessors, Wayne insisted on thorough training, proper supplies, and good information before starting his campaign. Wayne's careful approach paid off when he finally moved north from Cincinnati in 1793. His forces built a series of fortified positions as they advanced, creating safe supply lines and denying Native American forces the element of surprise that had worked so well in previous fights. Fort Greenville, built in west-central Ohio, became Wayne's main base for operations against the Native American alliance. The deciding fight came at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in August 1794, near present-day Toledo. Wayne's disciplined troops scattered the Native American forces in a short but fierce battle fought among fallen trees left by a recent tornado. The victory was made even more important by the refusal of British forces at nearby Fort Miami to give shelter to the defeated Native American warriors, showing Britain's unwillingness to risk war with the United States over Ohio. The Treaty of Greenville, signed in 1795, formally ended Native American resistance to American settlement in much of Ohio. The treaty set clear boundaries between American and Native American territory, with the Native American nations giving up most of present-day Ohio in exchange for yearly payments and recognition of their remaining land claims. Leaders like Little Turtle realized that continued military resistance was hopeless and chose negotiation over destruction of their peoples. The Greenville Treaty line ran roughly from present-day Cleveland southwest to Fort Recovery, then southeast to the Ohio River near Portsmouth. North and west of this line, Native American nations kept their lands and hunting rights, while south and east became open to American settlement. The treaty also set up trading posts where Native Americans could trade furs and other goods for manufactured items under federal oversight. With military resistance mostly ended, American settlement of Ohio went quickly. The federal government surveyed large areas of the territory, dividing the land into townships 6 miles square, each containing 36 sections of 640 acres. This orderly approach to land division created the straight property lines and rural road patterns that still mark much of Ohio today. Different regions of Ohio were settled by distinct groups with their own cultural characteristics. The Connecticut Western Reserve in northeastern Ohio attracted many New England families who brought with them traditions of town government, public education, and religious organization. Towns like Hudson and Oberlin were laid out according to New England models, with central commons and streets arranged in neat grids. The Virginia Military District, located between the Scioto and Little Miami rivers, was settled mainly by Virginians claiming land grants earned through Revolutionary War service. This region developed a more spread-out settlement pattern typical of the Upper South, with individual farms scattered across the landscape rather than gathered in compact villages. The county seat towns that grew up, places like Chillicothe and Circleville, served mainly as business and government centers rather than residential communities. German immigrants, both from Pennsylvania and directly from Europe, set up many settlements throughout Ohio. Their farming methods, often better than those of their Anglo-American neighbors, helped build Ohio's reputation for farm productivity. German communities like Zoar and other religious settlements created distinctive cultural landscapes that kept Old World traditions while adapting to New World conditions. The Sims Purchase, stretching along the Ohio River between the Miami and Little Miami rivers, became one of the fastest-growing parts of Ohio. Cincinnati grew into the region's main business center. Its location at the mouth of the Licking River gave it excellent access to Kentucky as well as the Ohio River trade routes. By 1800, Cincinnati had grown from a struggling frontier outpost into a thriving commercial town with nearly 1,000 people. River travel stayed crucial to Ohio's growth during these early years. The Ohio River provided the main connection to outside markets, carrying Ohio's farm goods downriver to New Orleans and the international markets beyond. Flatboats and keelboats crowded the river during spring floods, when high water made travel easiest and safest. The challenges of river travel were considerable. Low water in late summer and early fall could leave boats stuck for weeks, while ice in winter made travel impossible. Pirates and river bandits posed constant threats, particularly in the dangerous currents near Covington on the lower Ohio. boat crews had to be ready for both natural dangers and human predators during their trips. Despite these challenges, river trade flourished as Ohio's population grew. All merchants in Cincinnati and other river towns developed complex networks for buying Ohio produce and arranging its shipment to faraway markets. Pork packing became an early specialty, with Cincinnati earning the nickname Porkopolis for its huge slaughterhouses and meat processing plants. The growth of trade encouraged the development of supporting industries. Shipyards along the Ohio River built the flatboats and steamboats needed for river travel. Flour mills processed wheat, grown throughout Ohio's fertile valleys. Distilleries turned extra grain into whiskey, which was easier to transport than bulk goods and brought higher prices in distant markets. Ohio's territorial period saw remarkable population growth as news of the region's opportunities spread throughout the eastern states. The territorial census of 1800 counted nearly 43,000 people, well on the way to the 60,000 needed for statehood. Immigration sped up after the Treaty of Greenville removed the threat of Native American attacks, and by 1803, Ohio's population had reached the mark for admission to the Union, becoming the 17th state, 1803. The process of reaching statehood involved political as well as population milestones. Ohio's territorial government had grown from the one-man rule of Governor St. Clair to a more representative system that included an elected legislature. Political parties began to form, with Federalists generally backing strong federal authority and Democratic Republicans favoring states' rights and limited government. The question of Ohio's borders became a point of dispute as statehood approached. The Northwest Ordinance had said that Ohio should stretch north to a line drawn east from the southern tip of Lake Michigan, but this boundary would have left out the mouth of the Maumee River and the site of present-day Toledo. Ohio's political leaders demanded that the northern boundary be moved north to include this important trade area. Congress at first resisted Ohio's border demands, but the political importance of adding another Democratic-Republican state to the Union finally overcame these objections. Ohio was given the disputed territory, including Toledo, in exchange for accepting a somewhat smaller western boundary. This compromise satisfied Ohio's immediate needs while keeping options open for organizing the rest of the Northwest Territory. The Constitutional Convention that met in Chillicothe in November 1802 faced the task of creating a framework for Ohio's state government. The delegates, representing all parts of the territory, had to balance competing regional interests while creating institutions that could govern well. The resulting constitution showed the democratic ideals of the early republic while addressing the practical needs of a frontier society. Ohio's constitution set up a government with 3 branches, following the federal model, but gave most power to the legislature. The governor served only a 2-year term and had limited veto power, reflecting the democratic mistrust of executive authority that was common in the early republic. The Constitution also guaranteed certain individual rights, including freedom of religion and trial by jury. The question of slavery proved less controversial in Ohio than it would in later territorial organizations. The Northwest Ordinance had already banned slavery in the territory, and most Ohio settlers accepted this rule. The Constitution included provisions strengthening the ban on slavery, while also including a black code that severely limited the rights of free African Americans. Education got considerable attention in Ohio's Constitution, reflecting the New England influence on the state's political development. The Constitution required the legislature to set up a system of public schools supported by government funding, though it would take several decades for this requirement to be fully carried out. The federal land grants for education, including Section 16 in each township, gave important resources for starting schools. On March 1, 1803, Ohio officially became the 17th state of the Union. Though the formal admission process was somewhat irregular, Congress never passed a formal resolution admitting Ohio to statehood, leading to some confusion about the exact date of admission. This technicality was not corrected until 1953, when Congress formally made Ohio's admission to the Union official after the fact. Edward Tiffin, a Virginia-born doctor who had settled in Chillicothe, became Ohio's first governor. Tiffin faced the huge challenge of creating working state institutions while handling the practical problems of governing a fast-growing frontier society. His administration had to build everything from tax collection systems to militia organizations, often with very limited resources and experience. The location of Ohio's capital became a controversial political issue during the early statehood period. Chillicothe served as the territorial capital and continued in that role during the early years of statehood. But other communities lobbied hard for the honor. The central location and growing commercial importance of Columbus eventually made it the logical choice for a permanent capital, though the decision was not made until 1812. Ohio's admission to statehood marked a key milestone in American westward expansion. It proved that the ordinances of the 1780s could successfully turn wilderness territories into working states, providing a model that would be followed again and again as the United States spread across the continent. Ohio's success encouraged more migration and investment in the western lands. The early years of statehood also saw the beginning of Ohio's change from a frontier society into a more complex and developed community. Towns grew quickly as commercial and manufacturing activities expanded. Roads improved, connecting previously isolated communities and making trade and communication easier. Schools began to appear, including academies and eventually colleges that would serve the growing populations. Needs for learning and professional training. Yet, challenges remained significant. The northern and western parts of the state were still mostly unsettled, and Native American tribes kept large territorial holdings beyond the Greenville Treaty line. International tensions, particularly with Britain, threatened to disrupt the river trade that was crucial to Ohio's economic growth. The young state would soon face its first major test during the War of 1812. Waterways of Progress. The War of 1812 brought the reality of international conflict directly to Ohio's doorstep. Britain's naval blockade disrupted the river trade that had become crucial to Ohio's economy, while British agents in Canada worked to organize Native American attacks on American settlements. The war tested not only Ohio's military capabilities but also the loyalty and strength of its diverse population. Native American resistance to American expansion had never fully ended. Despite the Treaty of Greenville, leaders like Tecumseh of the Shawnee and his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, had been working to build a new alliance of tribes opposed to further American expansion. They set up a settlement called Prophetstown where the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers meet, just west of Ohio's border, where they gathered followers from many tribes. Tecumseh's message struck a chord with Native Americans, who had watched their traditional way of life steadily worn away by American expansion. He argued that the land belonged to all Native Americans together, and that no single tribe had the right to sell territory without the agreement of all. This way of thinking directly challenged the American practice of making separate treaties with individual tribes, often taking advantage of internal divisions to get land at good terms. The start of war between Britain and the United States in June 1812 gave Tecumseh the chance he had been waiting for. British officials in Canada welcomed Native American allies who could help defend their thinly populated territories against American attacks. They gave weapons, supplies, and military advisors to support Native American operations against American settlements and military posts. Ohio's exposed position made it especially open to these combined British and Native American attacks. The state's northern border was only lightly defended, and British control of Lake Erie meant that enemy forces could potentially land anywhere along Ohio's long coastline. Governor-in-Return Jonathan Meigs called out the state militia and asked the federal government for more military support. The war's early stages went badly for American forces in the Northwest. General William Hull's invasion of Canada from Detroit ended in humiliating surrender. When British and Native American forces surrounded his army, Hull's surrender left Ohio's western border completely exposed and encouraged more Native American attacks throughout the region. Fort Meigs, built near present-day Toledo to guard the mouth of the Maumee River, became the focus of intense fighting during 1813. British and Native American forces laid siege to the fort twice, hoping to capture this key American position and open the path to Ohio's interior. The successful defense of Fort Meigs, led by General William Henry Harrison, became a source of great pride for Ohioans and helped build Harrison's reputation as a military hero. Harrison's plan for defending Ohio focused on keeping control of key travel routes while building up forces for a counterattack. He set up a chain of forts stretching from the Ohio River north to Lake Erie, each position able to support the others and to deny enemy forces easy passage through Ohio's river valleys. These fortifications were manned by a mix of federal troops and Ohio militia. The turning point in the Northwest came with the Battle of Lake Erie in September 1813. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry's victory over a British naval squadron gave the Americans control of the lake and cut British supply lines to their forces in the region. Perry's famous message, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," announced a triumph that changed the whole strategic situation in the Northwest. With Lake Erie under American control, Harrison was finally able to launch his long-planned attack against British and Native American forces in the region. His army crossed the lake and chased the retreating British and their Native American allies deep into Canada. The deciding fight came at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813, where Harrison's forces won a complete victory that effectively ended organized resistance in the Northwest. Tecumseh's death during the Battle of the Thames marked the end of the most serious Native American challenge to American control of Ohio. Without his strong leadership, the Native American alliance that had threatened American settlements throughout the region began to fall apart. Individual tribes made separate peace agreements with the United States, often giving up more territory as the price of peace. The war's end in 1815 found Ohio in a much stronger position than it had been at the conflict's beginning. The state's population had kept growing despite wartime disruptions, reaching nearly 250,000 by the time of the first post-war census. The defeat of Native American resistance opened up large areas of northern and western Ohio to American settlement for the first time. Ohio's role in the war had also shown the state's growing importance within the Union. Ohio militiamen had served in campaigns from Lake Erie to New Orleans, earning reputations for courage and effectiveness. Political leaders like Harrison had gained national attention that would serve them well in post-war careers. The state had proven its loyalty and its ability during the nation's Second War for Independence. The war's end ushered in a period of unmatched growth and development for Ohio. With the threat of military conflict mostly gone, settlers poured into previously dangerous areas, building new communities and clearing large areas for farming. The great forests that had covered much of Ohio began to fall to the settlers' axes, replaced by farms, towns, and eventually cities. This change was made easier by major improvements in transportation that connected Ohio more closely to national and international markets. The completion of the Erie Canal in New York in 1825 gave a water route from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, greatly reducing the cost of shipping Ohio products to eastern markets. Almost overnight, wheat and corn grown in Ohio could compete with crops from much closer to major population centers. Ohio answered the Erie Canal's success by starting an ambitious canal-building program of its own. The Ohio and Erie Canal, finished in 1832, connected Lake Erie at Cleveland to the Ohio River at Portsmouth, providing a north-south water route through the heart of the state. A second canal, the Miami and Erie Canal, eventually connected Cincinnati to Toledo, creating an extensive network of inland waterways. These canals changed Ohio's economy and settlement patterns. Towns that had been isolated communities suddenly found themselves connected to national markets and transportation networks. Cleveland, which had been a small village of a few hundred people, grew quickly into a major port and commercial center. Cincinnati kept its position as the leading city in the Ohio River Valley, while new communities like Akron and Dayton grew into important canal towns. The canal era also brought big changes to Ohio's farming methods. Farmers who had previously grown crops, mainly for local use or for shipment down the Ohio River, could now sell their products in eastern markets where prices were often much higher. This access to markets encouraged specialization and better farming methods, leading to huge increases in farm production. Canal construction required enormous investments of money and labor, much of it provided by immigrants from Ireland and Germany. These workers faced dangerous conditions and low wages. But the completion of the canal system created steady jobs in canal maintenance, boat operations, and the various industries that grew up along the waterways. Many canal workers settled permanently in Ohio, adding to the state's ethnic variety. The success of Ohio's canal system encouraged further transportation improvements. Turnpike companies built better roads connecting major towns, while entrepreneurs tried out new forms of transportation. The first railroad in Ohio, connecting Toledo and Adrian, Michigan, was completed in 1836, beginning a transportation revolution that would eventually make canals outdated. But the canal era, short though it proved to be, had permanently changed Ohio's path of growth. The state had been turned from an isolated frontier region into an essential part of the national economy. Ohio's farmers, merchants, and manufacturers could now take part in markets that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Gulf of Mexico, creating chances for wealth and growth that earlier generations could never have imagined. The transportation revolution also helped the growth of Ohio's industrial sector. Access to raw materials from other regions, combined with Ohio's plentiful water power and growing population, made the state an appealing place for manufacturing businesses. Textile mills, iron foundries, and other early industrial operations began appearing in Ohio's towns and cities. Perhaps most importantly, the Kana era showed Ohio's commitment to internal improvements and economic development. The state had been willing to invest heavily in infrastructure projects that would benefit future generations. Even when the immediate costs were substantial, this forward-looking approach would mark Ohio's development throughout the 19th century and help build the state as a leader in American economic growth. The Underground Railroad. As Ohio's economy grew more varied and its population became more urban, the state began dealing with social and political issues that would shape much of the 19th century. The question of slavery, mostly theoretical during Ohio's early years as a free state, became increasingly pressing as the state's border with slaveholding. Kentucky brought the realities of human bondage closer to home. Ohio's position as a free state next to slave states made it a natural destination for enslaved people seeking freedom. The Ohio River, which formed the state's southern boundary, became a symbol, as well as a real barrier between freedom and slavery. Crossing that river meant crossing from slavery to freedom. Though the journey to true safety often required travel much farther north, the Underground Railroad, that loose network of safe houses, guides, and transportation routes that helped enslaved people escape to freedom, found some of its most important routes running through Ohio. Communities along the Ohio River from Portsmouth in the east to Cincinnati in the west became crucial stops for freedom seekers making their way north. The risks were huge for everyone involved, as federal fugitive slave laws made it a crime to help runaway slaves. Oberlin in northeastern Ohio became perhaps the most famous center of anti-slavery activity in the state. Oberlin College, founded in 1833, was one of the first American colleges to admit both African Americans and women on equal terms with white men. The town became a symbol of racial equality and a beacon of hope for those seeking freedom from slavery. The stories of individual escapes captured the imagination of Ohioans and helped build support for the anti-slavery cause. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who lived in Cincinnati during the 1830s and 1840s, used her observations of slavery and freedom to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel that would help unite Northern opposition to slavery in the years before the Civil War. But not all Ohioans backed the anti-slavery cause. The state's constitution included rules limiting the rights of free African Americans, and many communities kept informal barriers to black settlement. Race riots happened in Cincinnati and other Ohio cities during the 1830s and 1840s, showing that racial prejudice was not limited to slaveholding states. The growing national debate over slavery affected Ohio's political development in deep ways. The state's congressional delegation was deeply split on slavery-related issues, with representatives from different regions showing their voters varying views. Southern Ohio, with its close ties to Kentucky and the South, tended to be more sympathetic to slaveholding interests, while the Western Reserve, settled mainly by New Englanders, was strongly anti-slavery. These divisions became especially sharp during the Mexican-American War and the territorial expansion that followed. The question of whether slavery would be allowed in the lands taken from Mexico split the nation and forced Ohioans to face their own views on the spread of human bondage. The Compromise of 1850, which included a stronger fugitive slave law, brought these issues directly to Ohio's doorstep. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 required citizens to help in the capture and return of alleged runaway slaves, making it impossible for Ohioans to stay neutral on the slavery question. The law was widely resented in Ohio, where many citizens saw it as an attack on state authority and personal conscience. Several well-known fugitive slave cases in Ohio drew national attention and helped build opposition to the law. The most famous of these cases happened in Oberlin in 1858, when federal marshals arrested John Price, an alleged fugitive slave, and took him to nearby Wellington for transport back to Kentucky. A crowd of Oberlin residents, both black and white, rescued Price and helped him escape to Canada. The subsequent trial of the Wellington rescuers became a cause that highlighted the growing tensions between federal law and local feeling. Political parties in Ohio reflected and deepened these divisions over slavery. The Democratic Party generally supported federal policies that protected slavery where it existed, while the Whig Party was more divided on the issue. The rise of the Republican Party in the mid-1850s gave a political home to Ohioans who opposed the spread of slavery, even if they were not necessarily committed to immediate abolition. Ohio played a key role in the Republican Party's early growth. The party's focus on free labor and opposition to slavery spread resonated with many Ohioans who saw slavery as incompatible with American ideals of equality and opportunity. Republican organizers in Ohio helped build the alliance that would eventually elect Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in 1860. The election of 1860 showed how deeply Ohio was split over slavery and national policy. Lincoln carried the state, but many Ohioans voted for other candidates who promised to keep the Union together through compromise. The secession crisis that followed Lincoln's election forced Ohioans to choose between their loyalty to the Union and their desire to avoid a destructive civil war. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, most Ohioans rallied to support the Union cause. Governor William Dennison quickly organized regiments of volunteers to answer Lincoln's call for troops, and Ohio's response was among the most enthusiastic in the nation. The state's industrial capacity and farm output would prove crucial to the Union war effort over the next 4 years. But the decision for war was not unanimous in Ohio. Some citizens, particularly in southern counties with close ties to Kentucky, sympathized with the South, or at least opposed strong measures to keep the Union together. The Copperhead movement, as Southern sympathizers were known, stayed active throughout the war and made it harder to keep unity on the home front. Ohio's contribution to the Union cause went far beyond just providing soldiers, though the state's military contribution was substantial. More than 300,000 Ohioans served in the Union Army and Navy during the Civil War, representing nearly 10% of the state's total population. Ohio regiments fought in every major part of the war, from Virginia's battlefields to the campaigns in the West. The state's industrial capacity was just as important to the war effort. Ohio's factories produced weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and other supplies needed by Union forces. The state's farm output helped feed both the Union Army and the civilian population of the North. Ohio's railroads and canals moved men and materials to the front lines, while the state's financial institutions helped fund the war effort through bond purchases and other investments. Several Ohioans gained national attention during the Civil War. General Ulysses S. Grant, though born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, had moved to Illinois before the war but kept strong Ohio connections. General William T. Sherman, born in Lancaster, Ohio, became one of the Union's most effective commanders. General Philip Sheridan, born in Albany, Ohio, played key roles in both the Eastern and Western theaters. Political leadership from Ohio was equally important. Salmon Panja Chase, former Ohio governor and senator, served as Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury and later as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Sherman, brother of the general, served in Congress throughout the war and played key roles in financing the Union war effort. Edwin Stanton, born in Steubenville, served as Lincoln's Secretary of War during the crucial final years of the conflict. The war also brought big changes to Ohio's home front. Women took on new roles as nurses, teachers, and workers in jobs previously held by men. The ladies' aid societies that formed in communities across the state showed the capacity for organization and leadership that would later fuel the women's suffrage movement. African Americans, both longtime residents and recent refugees from slavery, found new chances for education and economic progress. The Emancipation Proclamation and the subsequent enlistment of African American soldiers gave new meaning to the war for many Ohioans. What had begun as a fight to preserve the Union had become a war to end slavery, fulfilling the hopes of abolitionists who had long argued that the nation could not survive half slave and half free. Ohio's African American communities celebrated these developments while continuing to work for full equality. The war's end in 1865 found Ohio changed in basic ways. The state had proven its loyalty to the Union and its ability to sacrifice in defense of national ideals. Ohio's industrial and farm sectors had grown dramatically to meet wartime demands, putting the state in position for continued growth during the post-war era. The end of slavery had settled the moral crisis that had divided Ohioans for decades, though the challenge of racial equality remained. Perhaps most importantly, the Civil War had confirmed Ohio's position as a key swing state in American politics. The state's electoral votes had helped decide the elections of 1860 and 1864, and Ohio politicians had played key roles in wartime leadership. This political importance would continue throughout the rest of the 19th century as Ohio became known as the mother of presidents for the remarkable number of chief executives it would produce. The mother of presidents, the post-Civil War era, often called the Gilded Age, brought unmatched wealth and growth to Ohio, the state's central location. Abundant natural resources and well-developed transportation networks made it an ideal center for the industrial expansion that marked late 19th century America. Ohio cities grew quickly as factories, mills, and refineries attracted workers from across the nation and around the world. Cleveland grew into one of America's great industrial cities during this period. The city's location on Lake Erie, combined with excellent railroad connections to coal fields and iron ore deposits, made it a natural center for steel production. The opening of iron ore mines in Minnesota's Mesabi Range gave Cleveland access to high-quality ore that could be shipped cheaply across the Great Lakes. When combined with coal from Pennsylvania and West Virginia, these resources made Cleveland steel competitive with production anywhere in the world. The city's growth was amazing. From a population of about 17,000 in 1850, Cleveland grew to more than 261,000 by 1890 and would reach nearly 400,000 by 1900. This rapid growth brought both opportunities and challenges. New immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and later from Eastern and Southern Europe gave the labor needed for industrial expansion, but they also created social tensions and housing shortages that strained the city's resources. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, based in Cleveland, became perhaps the most famous example of Gilded Age industrial consolidation. Rockefeller built his oil empire through a combination of efficient operations, strategic purchases, and sometimes harsh competitive practices. Standard Oil's Cleveland refinery became the largest in the world, processing crude oil from Pennsylvania and later from new fields in Ohio and other states. The discovery of oil in northwestern Ohio during the 1880s added another part to the state's industrial development. The Lim Indiana oil field, stretching from northwestern Ohio into eastern Indiana, produced a different type of crude oil than the Pennsylvania fields that had earlier ruled American production. Though at first considered lower quality, Ohio crude proved suitable for certain products and helped build the state as an important center of oil, refining and chemical production. Cincinnati kept its position as one of Ohio's most important cities during the Gilded Age. Though its growth was less dramatic than Cleveland's, the city's location on the Ohio River continued to give advantages for trade and transportation, while its established manufacturing base in areas like meatpacking, brewing, and machinery production continued to thrive. Cincinnati also became an important center for soap and candle manufacturing, with companies like Procter & Gamble building national reputations for quality and new ideas. The growth of Cincinnati's over-there-in neighborhood showed both the opportunities and challenges of rapid urban growth. German immigrants had built thriving communities in this area north of the city center, creating a distinctive cultural landscape with German-language newspapers, schools, and social groups. The neighborhood's breweries, beer gardens, and cultural institutions made it one of the most lively ethnic communities in America. Toledo's growth during this period was closely tied to its position as a Great Lakes port and railroad center. The city's location at the mouth of the Maumee River gave access to the rich farm regions of northwestern Ohio and southeastern Michigan, while its rail connections made it an important transfer point for goods moving between the east and west. Toledo's glass industry, taking advantage of plentiful natural gas deposits in the region, became nationally important during this period. Akron's change from a canal town into an industrial center showed the adaptability that marked Ohio's urban growth. The city's location along the Ohio and Erie Canal had made it an important transportation hub during the pre-Civil War period. But the growth of rubber manufacturing during the late 19th century gave Akron a new identity. Companies like Goodyear and Firestone set up major operations in the city, taking advantage of its transportation connections and available workforce. The rubber industry's growth was closely tied to the development of bicycles and later automobiles. As Americans embraced these new forms of transportation, the demand for rubber tires grew dramatically. Akron's rubber companies expanded quickly, attracting workers from throughout the Midwest and South. The city became linked with tire manufacturing, a position it would keep well into the 20th century. Dayton's industrial growth during this period was marked by new ideas and variety. The city became home to many small manufacturing companies, producing everything from cash registers to precision machinery. The Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, ran a bicycle shop in Dayton while working on their experiments in flight, showing the enterprising spirit that marked the city's industrial culture. Ohio's farm sector also did well during the Gilded Age. Though farming was increasingly overshadowed by industrial growth, the state's rich soils and good climate continued to produce abundant crops. Better transportation made it possible to ship Ohio products to markets throughout the nation. dairy farming became increasingly important, particularly in northeastern Ohio, where being close to growing urban markets made it profitable to focus on milk production. The mechanization of farming went quickly during this period, with Ohio farmers among the first to adopt new farm equipment. Reapers, threshers, and other labor-saving devices made it possible to farm larger areas with fewer workers, freeing rural workers for jobs in the growing industrial sector. This shift from farm to industrial work represented a basic change in Ohio's economic structure. Labor organization became increasingly important as Ohio's industrial sector expanded. Workers in factories, mines, and mills began forming unions to improve their working conditions and wages. The Knights of Labor, founded in Pennsylvania, set up many assemblies in Ohio during the 1870s and 1880s. Later, more specialized craft unions linked with the American Federation of Labor gained strength in Ohio's cities. Labor disputes sometimes turned violent, showing the tensions between workers seeking better conditions and employers trying to keep competitive costs. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 spread to Ohio cities like Cleveland and Columbus, where workers protested wage cuts and poor working conditions. State and federal troops were called in to restore order, but the underlying causes of labor unrest remained unsettled. The Haymarket Affair of 1886, though it happened in Chicago, had effects throughout Ohio as workers organized to demand an 80-hour workday. May Day demonstrations in Cleveland, Cincinnati, and other Ohio cities drew thousands of participants, showing the strength of labor organization in the state. These events helped build Ohio as an important center of the American labor movement. Women's roles in Ohio society began changing significantly during the Gilded Age. While most women stayed in domestic roles, growing numbers found jobs in factories, offices, and schools. The growth of department stores in Ohio's cities created new opportunities for women as salespeople and clerks. Teaching became increasingly done by women as communities tried to cut education costs by hiring women at lower wages than men typically demanded. The women's suffrage movement gained energy in Ohio during this period. Leaders like Frances Willard, who served as president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, argued that women needed the vote to protect their families and communities from the evils of alcohol and political wrongdoing. Though Ohio women would not get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, the foundations for that victory were laid during the Gilded Age. Immigration changed Ohio's ethnic makeup during this period. While German and Irish immigrants continued to arrive, they were joined by growing numbers of people from Eastern and Southern Europe. Polish, Italian, Hungarian, and Czech immigrants set up communities in Ohio's industrial cities, often clustering in specific neighborhoods where they could keep their cultural traditions while adapting to American life. These new immigrant communities faced major challenges, including language barriers, discrimination, and economic exploitation. Many worked in dangerous industrial jobs for low wages, living in crowded housing near factories and mills. Yet they also brought valuable skills, cultural richness, and enterprising energy that added to Ohio's continued growth and development. African-American migration to Ohio sped up during the late 19th century as economic opportunities in the state's cities attracted people looking for alternatives to the farm economy of the South. Cleveland, Cincinnati, and other Ohio cities developed substantial African-American communities, complete with churches, businesses, and social groups. However, racial discrimination remained a major barrier to full participation in Ohio's economic and social life. The rise of a small but significant African-American middle class showed the possibilities for progress despite discrimination. Professionals like teachers, ministers, and business owners gave leadership for their communities while working to expand opportunities for all African Americans. The establishment of newspapers like the Cleveland Gazette gave voice to African American concerns and hopes. Education became increasingly important as Ohio's economy grew more complex and technological. The state's public school system, required by the Constitution but unevenly carried out during the early statehood period, began to develop more systematically. Urban school systems in particular expanded quickly, offering not just basic reading and writing but also the technical and business skills needed in an industrial economy. Higher education also expanded significantly during this period. Ohio State University, founded in 1870 as a land-grant institution, grew quickly and began developing programs in engineering, farming, and other practical fields. Private colleges and universities, many with religious ties, also flourished as Ohio's growing wealth created both demand for higher education and resources to support it. The development of libraries, museums, and other cultural places showed Ohio's growing sophistication and wealth. Andrew Carnegie's giving supported the building of public libraries in many Ohio communities, while wealthy industrialists like Henry Clay Frick and Charles Brush donated money for museums and cultural centers. These institutions helped build Ohio's cities as centers of culture and learning, not just industrial production. Transportation continued to change during the Gilded Age, with railroads largely replacing canals as the main way of moving goods and people. Ohio became a key hub in the national railroad network, with lines coming together in Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, and other major cities. The Pennsylvania Railroad, New York Central, Baltimore and Ohio, and other major lines competed fiercely for Ohio's freight and passenger traffic, driving down costs and improving service. The railroad boom created new opportunities and challenges for Ohio communities. Towns lucky enough to be located along major rail lines did well, while those passed over by the railroads often slowed down or declined. The concentration of railroad traffic in certain cities strengthened their control over their regions, making places like Cleveland and Cincinnati even more important as commercial and industrial centers. Railroad construction also created significant job opportunities, both during the building phase and in ongoing operations. Irish and German immigrants found work laying track, building bridges, and running trains. Railroad shops in cities like Columbus and Lima gave steady work to skilled workers who built and kept up locomotives and rail cars. These facilities became important centers of mechanical new ideas and technical know-how. The influence of railroads went far beyond transportation. Railroad companies became some of Ohio's largest landowners, and their decisions about where to build lines and locate stations could make or break communities. Railroad executives had enormous political influence, often working closely with state and local governments to get favorable laws and public money for their projects. As the 19th century drew to a close, Ohio had built itself as one of America's most important industrial states. The combination of natural resources, central location, transportation infrastructure, and human skills had created a powerful engine for economic growth. But this success came with costs that were becoming increasingly clear to thoughtful observers. Environmental damage was one obvious result of rapid industrialization. The skies above Cleveland and other industrial cities were often thick with smoke from steel mills and other factories. Rivers became polluted with industrial waste, affecting both water quality and fish populations. The great forests that had once covered much of Ohio had been mostly cleared, replaced by farms, cities, and industrial facilities. Social problems coming with industrialization were just as serious. The gap between rich and poor had widened dramatically, with industrial giants like John D. Rockefeller piling up huge fortunes while many workers struggled to get by. Child labor was common in factories and mines, taking away young people's education and normal childhoods. Industrial accidents hurt and killed workers at alarming rates. Political wrongdoing also became a serious problem as wealthy interests tried to influence government decisions. The close relationships between railroad companies and politicians sometimes resulted in laws that helped private interests at public expense. City governments in rapidly growing cities often struggled to provide adequate services, creating opportunities for political machines that traded votes for favors. Yet, Ohio also produced leaders who worked to address these problems. The progressive movement that emerged in the early 20th century found strong support in Ohio, where reformers worked to improve working conditions, expand educational opportunities, and clean up political corruption. This reform tradition would help Ohio handle the challenges of the new century while building on the achievements of the Gilded Age. The story of Ohio's rise to national importance is perhaps best shown through the remarkable number of presidents the state produced during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Between 1869 and 1923, 7 of the 12 men who served as president were born in Ohio, earning the state its nickname as the Mother of Presidents. This extraordinary concentration of political leadership showed Ohio's growing importance in national affairs and the skills that frontier and industrial life had developed in its citizens. Ulysses S. Grant, though he had moved to Illinois before the Civil War, was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio. In 1822, His humble beginnings in a small Ohio river town seemed unlikely preparation for military genius and political leadership. Yet Grant's experiences growing up on the frontier may have helped the practical problem-solving abilities that served him well as commanding general and president. Grant's presidency from 1869 to 1877 coincided with Ohio's rapid industrial development. Though his administration was damaged by scandals involving his associates, Grant himself kept the personal honesty that had marked his military service. His efforts to protect the civil rights of freed slaves showed values that many Ohioans shared, even if his political skills proved inadequate for the complex challenges of Reconstruction. Rutherford B. Hayes, born in Delaware, Ohio, in 1822, brought a different set of qualities to the presidency. A lawyer and Civil War veteran, Hayes had served as governor of Ohio before winning the disputed presidential election of 1876. His administration marked the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of efforts to reform the federal civil service system. Hayes's presidency showed the growing influence of Ohio's educated middle class in national politics. His commitment to civil service reform and honest government reflected values that were becoming increasingly important to voters tired of political corruption. Though his single term was marked by economic difficulties and labor unrest, Hayes helped restore dignity to the presidency after the scandals of the Grant years. James A. Garfield represented another type of Ohio leader, born in a log cabin in Orange Township in 1831. Garfield embodied the American dream of rising from poverty to importance through education and hard work. He worked as a canal boatman, teacher, and preacher before studying law and entering politics. His murder, after only 4 months in office, cut short what might have been a transformative presidency. Garfield's brief time in office highlighted the ongoing struggle over civil service reform and the proper role of government in an increasingly complex industrial society. His death at the hands of a disappointed office seeker helped build support for the civil service reforms that would be carried out during later administrations. Chester A. Arthur, who took over after Garfield, was actually born in Vermont, but Benjamin Harrison, elected in 1888, was a true Ohio product, born in North Bend in 1833. Harrison's presidency coincided with the height of the Gilded Age, and he oversaw major expansions of federal power and spending. The Sherman Antitrust Act and the McKinley Tariff were both signed during his administration, reflecting growing concerns about monopolistic business practices and foreign competition. Harrison's defeat for re-election in 1892 marked a temporary break in Ohio's control of the presidency, but William McKinley's victory in 1896 returned an Ohioan to the White House. Born in Niles, Ohio, in 1843, McKinley had served as a Civil War officer, lawyer, and congressman before winning the presidency on a platform of protective tariffs and sound money. McKinley's presidency marked America's rise as a world power through victory in the Spanish-American War and the taking of overseas territories. His murder in 1901 by an anarchist in Buffalo, New York, shocked the nation and brought Theodore Roosevelt to power. McKinley's death marked the end of an era in which Ohio politicians had ruled American politics for more than 3 decades. The final Ohio president of this remarkable era was Warren G. Harding, born in Blooming Grove, Ohio, in 1865. Harding's election in 1920 represented a reaction against the progressive reforms and international commitments of the Wilson years. His campaign promise of a return to normalcy appealed to voters exhausted by war and social upheaval. Harding's presidency was cut short by his death in 1923, but his administration was already being stained by scandals involving his appointees. The Teapot Dome scandal and other corruption cases reminded Americans that Ohio politicians, like those from other states, were open to the temptations of power and wealth. What made Ohio such fertile ground for presidential candidates during this period? Several factors seem to have helped the state's remarkable political productivity. Ohio's position as a swing state in presidential elections meant that politicians who could win there had shown broad appeal across different regions and interest groups. The state's diverse economy, including both farm and industrial sectors, required political leaders who could understand and represent varied groups. The frontier experience that shaped many of these Ohio presidents may also have been important. Growing up in a society where success depended on personal effort, practical problem solving, and community cooperation may have developed skills that proved valuable in national leadership. The relative equality of frontier society, where birth and family connections mattered less than individual ability, may have encouraged the kind of democratic values that appealed to American voters. Ohio's schools also played a role in preparing political leaders. The state's commitment to public education, shown in its constitution and carried out through local school systems, created an unusually literate and informed population. Higher education opportunities, though limited compared to later standards, were enough to develop the thinking skills needed for political leadership. The military experience that many Ohio presidents gained during the Civil War was another important factor. Service in that conflict taught lessons in leadership, organization, and strategic thinking that proved valuable in civilian careers. The moral clarity of the Union cause also gave these men a sense of purpose and confidence that served them well in political life. Perhaps most importantly, Ohio's political culture during this period encouraged participation and debate. The state's competitive party system meant that politicians had to develop skills in persuasion and coalition building to succeed. Town halls, political rallies, and newspaper debates created an environment where political ideas could be tested and improved before being presented to national audiences. The Ohio presidents of this era shared certain qualities that showed their common background. Most came from modest circumstances and achieved success through their own efforts rather than inherited advantages. They tended to be practical men who focused on concrete problems rather than abstract theories. Their military service gave them experience in leadership under pressure, while their legal training provided thinking skills needed for complex policy questions. Yet these men also showed the limits of their time and place. All were white males from Protestant backgrounds, and their views were shaped by the cultural assumptions of 19th century America. Their opinions on race, gender, and class showed the prejudices as well as the hopes of their era. The corruption that stained some of their administrations showed that Ohio politicians were no more immune to the temptations of power than leaders from other states. The concentration of presidential leadership in Ohio during this period was both a cause and a result of the state's growing national importance. Ohio's electoral votes were crucial in close presidential elections, making the state a natural focus of political attention. The success of Ohio politicians on the national stage improved the state's reputation and encouraged other ambitious Ohioans to seek national office. This political importance also showed Ohio's economic and social development during the Gilded Age. A state that could produce leaders capable of governing a rapidly industrializing nation was clearly a place where important developments were happening. The skills that proved valuable in Ohio's competitive political environment were the same ones needed to handle the complex challenges facing the nation as a whole. As the 19th century ended, Ohio's political leadership began to change in response to new conditions. The progressive movement that emerged in the early 1900s produced a new generation of reformers who sought to address the social problems created by industrialization. These leaders, while still showing Ohio's practical political tradition, were more willing to use government power to regulate business and protect workers. The end of Ohio's presidential dominance after Harding's death in 1923 coincided with broader changes in American politics and society. The rise of mass media, the growing importance of primary elections, and the increasing complexity of government reduced the advantages that came from Ohio's particular political culture. Other states began producing candidates with equal claim to national leadership. Yet, Ohio's contribution to American political development during this crucial period cannot be overstated. At a time when the nation was changing from an agricultural republic into an industrial democracy, Ohio produced leaders who helped guide that change. Their successes and failures, their achievements and limits showed both the opportunities and the challenges of their remarkable era. The legacy of Ohio's presidential leadership goes beyond the individual accomplishments of these men. They helped set examples for democratic leadership that influenced later generations of political leaders. Their commitment to public service, despite its sometimes imperfect execution, showed the possibilities for leadership in a democratic society. Most importantly, their Ohio origins showed that in America, leadership could come from the most unlikely places and circumstances. Ohio's age of innovation. As Ohio entered the 20th century, the state stood at the front of technological innovation that would change not just America but the whole world. The Wright brothers' achievement of powered flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, in 1903, represented the result of experiments they had begun in their Dayton bicycle shop. Their success showed Ohio's capacity for the kind of practical new ideas that were reshaping modern life. Wilbur and Orville Wright showed the inventive spirit that had long marked Ohio. their careful approach to the problems of flight, combining theoretical understanding with hands-on testing, reflected values deeply rooted in Ohio's culture. The bicycle shop where they developed their flying machines was typical of the small manufacturing businesses that dotted Ohio's cities, places where skilled workers could pursue ambitious projects with limited resources but unlimited imagination. The Wright brothers' success was built on years of careful watching and testing. They studied the flight of birds, built a wind tunnel to test wing designs, and built a series of gliders to perfect their control systems before attempting powered flight. Their step-by-step approach to new ideas contrasted sharply with the more showy but less successful efforts of other aviation pioneers. The choice of Kitty Hawk for their flight tests was practical rather than symbolic. The North Carolina location offered steady winds, soft sand for landing, and privacy for their experiments. But the airplane they tested there was designed and built in Dayton using skills and techniques developed in Ohio's workshops. The success at Kitty Hawk was as much a triumph of Ohio cleverness as of individual genius. The Wright brothers' achievement had immediate effects on Ohio's economy and reputation. Dayton became a center of aviation development as other inventors and entrepreneurs sought to build on the Wrights' pioneering work. The city's existing base of precision manufacturing and mechanical know-how made it a natural location for the growing aircraft industry. But the Wrights were not the only Ohio innovators making history during this period. Thomas Edison, though, born in Ohio and spending his early years in Milan, had set up his famous laboratory in New Jersey. His inventions, including the incandescent light bulb, phonograph, and motion picture camera, changed daily life and created whole new industries. Edison's approach to invention, combining scientific principles with practical uses, influenced countless other inventors. Charles Kettering, working in Dayton for the National Cash Register Company, and later for General Motors, developed new ideas that changed the automobile industry. His electric starter eliminated the dangerous and difficult process of hand-cranking automobile engines, making cars available to a much wider range of users. Kettering's work on automotive electrical systems, paints, and fuels helped build Ohio as a center of automotive technology. The Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, known as Delco, became one of Ohio's most important technology companies. Founded by Kettering and others, Delco specialized in electrical and ignition systems for automobiles, eventually becoming a major supplier to General Motors and other manufacturers. The company's success showed Ohio's ability to move beyond basic manufacturing into high-technology industries. Ohio's industrial base gave crucial support for these new ideas. The state's steel mills, machine shops, and chemical plants could produce the materials and parts needed for new technologies. The concentration of manufacturing skill in cities like Cleveland, Akron, and Cincinnati created networks of suppliers and contractors who could support ambitious development projects. Schools also played important roles in encouraging new ideas. Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland, founded in 1880, trained engineers and scientists who contributed to Ohio's technological development. The University of Cincinnati's Cooperative Education Program, set up in 1906, created connections between academic research and industrial practice that benefited both students and employers. The rubber industry in Akron showed Ohio's ability to innovate in established industries as well as new ones. Companies like Goodyear, Firestone, and General Tire developed new processes for manufacturing rubber products and new uses for rubber technology. The pneumatic tire, perfected in Akron factories, made possible the automobile revolution that was changing American society. Akron's rubber companies also pioneered new approaches to industrial organization and worker relations. Some firms tried profit-sharing plans, company housing, and other programs designed to attract and keep skilled workers. These new ideas in human relations were as important as technological advances in keeping Ohio's industrial competitiveness. The automobile industry itself had important Ohio connections beyond Kettering's new ideas. Alexander Winton, a Cleveland bicycle manufacturer, became one of America's early automobile producers. His Winton Motor Carriage Company built some of the first commercially successful automobiles in America, showing that motorized transportation was possible. Though Winton's company eventually failed, it helped build Cleveland as an early center of automotive manufacturing. Ohio's role in the growing automotive industry went beyond individual companies to include the development of supporting industries and infrastructure. The state's steel mills gave materials for automobile frames and bodies. Its machine shops produced the precision tools needed for automotive manufacturing. Its glass industry, centered in Toledo, supplied windshields and windows for the growing number of motor vehicles. The oil industry also benefited from Ohio's ability to innovate. The discovery of natural gas in northwestern Ohio led to the development of new ways to get and process it. Companies like Toledo Gas, an oil company, pioneered methods for finding and developing oil and gas fields that were later used in other regions. The state's refining industry adapted to handle different types of crude oil and to produce the gasoline needed for automobiles. Chemical manufacturing became increasingly important in Ohio during this period. The state's salt deposits gave raw materials for chemical production, while its transportation infrastructure made it possible to bring in other needed materials from faraway places. Companies like Lubrisa in Wycliffe developed special chemicals for automotive and industrial uses, building Ohio as a center of chemical innovation. The electrical industry also found Ohio to be good ground for development. General Electric set up major operations in several Ohio cities, taking advantage of the state's skilled workforce and industrial infrastructure. The development of electrical power systems for cities and industries created new opportunities for companies that could produce generators, motors, and control equipment. Ohio's contribution to early broadcasting technology was another example of the state's ability to innovate. The first commercial radio station in Ohio began broadcasting from Pittsburgh in 1920, but Ohio stations quickly followed. KDKA in Cleveland and WLW in Cincinnati became powerful regional broadcasters that helped build radio as a major form of communication and entertainment. The motion picture industry also had Ohio connections during its early development. The American Film Company, based in Chicago, but with operations in Ohio, produced hundreds of silent films during the 1910s and 1920s. Though Hollywood eventually became the center of American film production, Ohio's early involvement in the industry showed the state's openness to new technologies and forms of entertainment. These various new ideas and industries created a climate of technological hope in Ohio during the early 20th century. The state seemed to be at the front of developments that were reshaping modern life, from transportation and communication to entertainment and consumer goods. This technological leadership improved Ohio's national reputation and attracted investment and talent from throughout the country. But technological innovation also brought challenges that Ohio communities had to address. The fast pace of change made some traditional industries outdated while creating demands for new skills and forms of organization. Workers had to adapt to new machinery and production methods, while communities had to provide the infrastructure needed to support growing industries. Environmental concerns also began to appear as the combined effects of industrialization became more obvious. Air pollution from factories and power plants affected the health and quality of life in Ohio's cities. Water pollution from industrial waste threatened rivers and lakes that communities depended on for drinking water and recreation. The challenge of balancing economic growth with environmental protection would become increasingly important in later decades. The social effects of technological change were equally complex. New industries created opportunities for economic progress, but they also broke up traditional ways of life. Rural communities lost population as young people moved to cities for industrial jobs. Immigrant communities brought new cultural variety but also created tensions with established residents. Women found new opportunities in offices and factories, but they also faced discrimination and exploitation. Despite these challenges, Ohio's record of innovation during the early 20th century built the state as a leader in American technological development. The practical problem-solving approach that marked Ohio inventors and entrepreneurs became a model for industrial research and development. The state's ability to turn scientific discoveries into commercially successful products showed the value of combining theoretical knowledge with hands-on experience. The Wright brothers' success was perhaps the most dramatic example of this Ohio approach to innovation, but it was by no means alone. Throughout the state, inventors, entrepreneurs, and skilled workers were contributing to the technological revolution that was changing American society. Their achievements helped build Ohio as a center of American industrial and technological leadership, a position the state would keep well into the 20th century. As Ohio entered the 1920s, the state seemed to show the technological hope and economic good times that marked the decade. The automobile industry was booming, giving markets for Ohio's steel, rubber, and glass. The aviation industry, born in Dayton, was beginning to develop commercial uses. Radio broadcasting was creating new forms of entertainment and communication that connected Ohio communities to the wider world. Yet beneath this surface prosperity, changes were happening that would soon test Ohio's strength and ability to adapt. The farm sector was struggling with overproduction and falling prices. Some traditional industries were facing more competition from other regions. The concentration of industrial ownership was creating new forms of economic power that challenged traditional ideas about competition and opportunity. The stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed would soon show the weak spots that came with Ohio's industrial success. But the foundation of technological innovation and practical problem solving that had been built during the early 20th century would prove crucial in helping the state handle the challenges that lay ahead. The Great Depression, the good times and hope that marked Ohio during the 1920s came to a sudden stop with the stock market collapse of October 1929. The Great Depression that followed tested Ohio's industrial economy more severely than any earlier crisis, showing the weak spots that came with the state's dependence on heavy manufacturing and exposing the harsh realities faced by working families when economic systems failed. Ohio's industrial cities were hit particularly hard by the economic collapse. Steel mills in Cleveland, Youngstown, and other centers of heavy industry cut production drastically or shut down entirely as demand for their products dried up. The automobile industry, which had been one of the most dynamic parts of the economy, saw production drop as consumers could no longer afford new cars. Akron's rubber plants laid off thousands of workers as tire sales collapsed along with automobile production. The human cost of these industrial shutdowns was staggering. By 1933, nearly 40% of Ohio's industrial workers were unemployed, and many others were working shorter hours or accepting lower wages just to keep their jobs. Whole neighborhoods in industrial cities became like ghost towns as families lost their homes and were forced to find shelter wherever they could. Cleveland's experience during the Depression showed the size of the crisis facing Ohio's urban areas. The city's population had grown to nearly 900,000 by 1930, supported by a varied industrial base that included steel, automobiles, and chemical production. But when the Depression hit, this industrial variety gave little protection against economic collapse. Major employers like Republic Steel and White Motor Company drastically cut their workforces, while smaller manufacturers often closed for good. The city's financial situation became desperate as property tax income fell and demands for relief services soared. Cleveland teetered on the edge of bankruptcy several times during the early 1930s, saved only by federal help and emergency borrowing arrangements. The city government struggled to provide basic services while trying to help the growing number of destitute residents. Cincinnati faced similar challenges, though its more varied economy gave somewhat better protection against the worst effects of the Depression. The city's traditional industries, including soap manufacturing and meatpacking, kept running at lower levels since people still needed these basic products. However, unemployment remained high and social tensions increased as different ethnic and racial groups competed for scarce jobs. Akron's situation was particularly severe because of the city's heavy dependence on rubber manufacturing. When automobile production collapsed, demand for tires fell dramatically, forcing major rubber companies to lay off most of their workers. The city that had once been linked with American industrial might became a symbol of economic ruin, with unemployment rates reaching levels that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Rural Ohio faced different but equally serious challenges during the Depression. Farm prices had been falling throughout the 1920s, and the economic collapse made the situation much worse. Wheat, corn, and other basic crops sold for prices that were often below the cost of production, forcing many farmers into bankruptcy or foreclosure. The Dust Bowl conditions that affected parts of the Great Plains also affected some areas of Ohio, adding environmental disaster to economic hardship. The banking crises that came with the Depression created additional problems for both urban and rural Ohio. Bank failures wiped out the savings of countless families, while the tightening of credit made it nearly impossible for businesses to get the loans needed to keep operating. The collapse of local banks particularly affected small towns and rural areas, which often depended on a single institution for all their financial services. Ohio's response to the Depression at first relied heavily on private charity and local government help, following the traditional American approach to social welfare. Churches, service groups, and wealthy individuals organized relief efforts to help the unemployed and homeless. But the size of the crisis quickly overwhelmed these traditional sources of help, making it clear that more substantial action would be needed. Local governments tried to provide relief through public works projects and direct aid programs, but their resources were limited by falling tax income and legal limits on deficit spending. Cities like Cleveland and Cincinnati set up soup kitchens and homeless shelters, but these facilities were quickly overwhelmed by the number of people seeking help. The sight of long red lines in once prosperous Ohio cities became a powerful symbol of the Depression's impact. The election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt to the presidency in 1932 marked the beginning of a new approach to addressing the economic crisis. Roosevelt's New Deal programs gave federal help on a scale never before attempted in American history, and Ohio became one of the main beneficiaries of these efforts. The state's political influence, combined with the severity of its economic problems, made it a priority for federal attention. The Civilian Conservation Corps set up camps throughout Ohio where young men could find jobs while working on conservation and park development projects. These camps gave jobs to thousands of Ohio youth while creating lasting improvements to the state's natural resources. State parks, forest trails, and flood control projects built by CCC workers became lasting legacies of the Depression era. The Works Progress Administration started many projects in Ohio's cities and towns, employing writers, artists, and skilled workers on public building and cultural projects. WPA workers built schools, post offices, and city buildings throughout the state, many of which still serve their communities today. The program also supported Ohio artists and writers who recorded the state's history and culture during this difficult period. The Public Works Administration paid for major infrastructure projects that helped modernize Ohio's cities while giving jobs to construction workers. New bridges, highways, and public buildings built with PWA money improved the state's infrastructure and showed the federal government's commitment to economic recovery. The Cincinnati Museum Center and Cleveland's Municipal Stadium were among the notable projects finished with federal help. Farm programs under the New Deal gave crucial support to Ohio's farming communities. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration helped steady farm prices by reducing production and giving payments to participating farmers. Rural electrification programs brought electric power to previously isolated farming areas, improving both productivity and quality of life for rural residents. Social Security, set up in 1935, gave a safety net for elderly and disabled Ohioans that had never existed before. The program represented a basic shift in American social policy, recognizing the federal government's responsibility for citizens' welfare in a complex industrial society. Ohio's aging industrial workers, many of whom had lost their savings during the bank failures, particularly benefited from this new form of security. Labor organizations sped up during the Depression as workers sought to protect themselves against employer exploitation and unfair firing. The Congress of Industrial Organizations started major organizing campaigns in Ohio's steel and automobile industries, often meeting violent resistance from employers and local authorities. The sit-down strikes at General Motors plants in 1936 to 1937 showed the growing militancy of industrial workers. The Little Steel Strike of 1937 in Cleveland and other Ohio cities marked a turning point in labor relations, when several major steel companies refused to recognize the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. Workers started strikes that were met with violent opposition. The Memorial Day Massacre at Republic Steel's Chicago plant, which left 10 strikers dead, shocked the nation and increased support for workers' rights to organize. These labor struggles had lasting effects on Ohio's political landscape. The state's Democratic Party strengthened its ties to organized labor, while Republicans found themselves increasingly identified with business interests. This political realignment would influence Ohio elections for decades to come, as labor votes became crucial in deciding the outcome of major contests. African Americans in Ohio faced particular hardships during the Depression. Already subject to job discrimination, they were often the first to lose their jobs when economic conditions worsened. The last hired, first fired pattern that marked many industries hit African American workers especially hard. At the same time, most New Deal programs, particularly in their early years, did little to address racial discrimination. Despite these challenges, the Depression also created some opportunities for African American progress. Federal programs, like the WPA, employed African Americans in significant numbers, often giving better working conditions and wages than they had experienced in private jobs. The Roosevelt administration's appointment of African Americans to federal positions, though limited, represented a symbolic break with previous practices. Women's experiences during the Depression were complex and conflicting. Traditional gender roles suggested that married women should not take jobs away from unemployed men. Yet economic need often forced families to depend on women's wages. Many women found jobs in traditional female occupations like teaching, nursing, and office work, which was somewhat less affected by the industrial collapse. The Depression also sped up certain social changes that had been developing throughout the 1920s. Geographic movement increased as families searched for jobs, breaking down traditional community ties. Rural to urban migration continued despite high city unemployment as young people sought alternatives to farm life. These population movements would have lasting effects on Ohio's population patterns. Popular culture gave important psychological relief from the hardships of the Depression. Radio broadcasting, which had expanded quickly during the 1920s, became even more important as a source of entertainment and information. Ohio stations like WLW in Cincinnati became powerful regional broadcasters, giving news, music, and comedy programs that helped keep up morale during difficult times. Movies also gave escape from Depression realities, and Ohio cities kept lively entertainment districts despite economic hardships. The fancy movie palaces built during the 1920s continued to attract audiences looking for temporary relief from their troubles. Hollywood's glamorous portrayals of American life gave hope that better times might return. Sports became particularly important as a form of community identity and pride during the Depression. Professional teams in Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus gave focal points for civic loyalty that helped keep community unity during difficult times. High school and college sports also thrived, giving young people chances for achievement and recognition despite economic limits. By the late 1930s, economic conditions in Ohio were beginning to improve, though full recovery would not come until the start of World War II. New Deal programs had given crucial help during the worst years of the crisis, while also creating infrastructure and institutions that would support future growth. Perhaps most importantly, the Depression had shown the strength and ability to adapt of Ohio's people in the face of never-before-seen challenges. The lessons learned during the Depression would influence Ohio's approach to economic development for decades to come. The importance of economic variety became clear as communities that had depended too heavily on single industries suffered the worst hardships. The role of government in giving economic stability and social welfare was permanently expanded, creating expectations that would shape future policy debates. Labor organization came out of the Depression significantly stronger, with unions playing important roles in Ohio's major industries. This development would influence not only wages and working conditions, but also political alignments and social policies throughout the mid-20th century. The experience of economic collapse and recovery had created new relationships between workers, employers, and government that would define Ohio's industrial landscape for generations. As the 1930s drew to a close, Ohio stood ready for another major change. The approach of World War II would bring new challenges and opportunities that would test everything the state had learned during its difficult passage through the Great Depression. The industrial capacity that had been idle during the economic crisis would soon be desperately needed for military production, marking the beginning of another crucial chapter in Ohio's ongoing story. Ohio at War. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, changed Ohio almost overnight, from a state still recovering from the Great Depression into one of America's most crucial centers of wartime production. The industrial infrastructure that had struggled through the 1930s suddenly became vital to national survival as Ohio's factories, skilled workers, and natural resources were called up for the greatest military effort in American history. Ohio's contribution to the war effort was staggering in its size and importance. The state produced more military aircraft than any other except California, made huge amounts of steel for ships and weapons, and supplied rubber products essential for military vehicles. Cities like Cleveland, Akron, Dayton, and Cincinnati became busy centers of production, where factory whistles marked not just shift changes, but the rhythm of a nation at war. The aircraft industry experienced perhaps the most dramatic change. Wright Field in Dayton, already an important center for aviation development, became one of the military's main research and testing facilities. The field expanded quickly to handle new aircraft designs and the growing number of personnel needed to develop and test military aviation technology. Dayton's manufacturers changed their facilities to produce aircraft parts, adding to the huge fleet of bombers and fighters that would carry the war to America's enemies. Cleveland's steel industry, which had struggled to find markets during the Depression, suddenly faced the overwhelming demand for its products. Republic Steel, US Steels, Cleveland Works, and other major producers ran at full capacity throughout the war, supplying materials for ships, tanks, aircraft, and countless other military uses. The great furnaces that had been idle during the 1930s roared back to life, their flames visible from miles away as they worked around the clock to meet production goals. Akron's rubber companies found themselves in a particularly crucial position when Japan's takeover of Southeast Asian territories cut off America's main sources of natural rubber. Goodyear, Firestone, and General Tire led efforts to develop synthetic rubber production, a technological challenge that required never-before-seen cooperation between government, industry, and academic researchers. The success of these efforts was essential not only for military vehicles but also for keeping civilian transportation going. The development of synthetic rubber represented one of Ohio's most important contributions to wartime technology. Scientists and engineers at the University of Akron worked closely with industry researchers to develop ways to make artificial rubber that could replace the natural material from Southeast Asia. This teamwork between academic and industrial research became a model for later technological development programs. Women entered Ohio's industrial workforce in never-before-seen numbers during the war, taking jobs that had previously been held by men. Aircraft plants in Dayton and Cleveland employed thousands of women as riveters, welders, and assemblers. Steel mills hired women for various production jobs, though they were typically kept out of the most physically demanding positions. These Rosie the Riveters proved that gender was no barrier to industrial skill and productivity. The flood of women into jobs once held mostly by men created both opportunities and tensions. Many women discovered abilities they had never had the chance to develop while earning wages that gave never-before-seen economic independence. But traditional gender roles were challenged by these developments, creating social tensions that would last long after the war ended. Daycare centers had to be set up to care for the children of working mothers, a service that had rarely been needed before. African Americans also found new opportunities in Ohio's wartime industries, though often only after considerable struggle against discrimination. The Fair Employment Practices Committee, set up by President Roosevelt, helped open some jobs once closed to African American workers. Steel mills, aircraft plants, and other major employers hired African Americans in significant numbers for the first time, though they were often kept in less desirable positions. The movement of African Americans to Ohio's industrial cities sped up during the war, as word spread about job opportunities. Cleveland's African American population grew by more than 60% during the 1940s, while Cincinnati and other cities had similar increases. This migration created new communities and institutions, while also causing housing shortages and social tensions in areas once mostly white. Housing shortages became severe problems throughout Ohio as the wartime boom attracted workers from rural areas and other states. Cities that had seen population decline during the Depression suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with newcomers seeking jobs in defense plants. Temporary housing projects were quickly built, while existing residents took in boarders to help meet the demand for places to live. Ohio's farm sector also played crucial roles in the war effort, producing food for both military personnel and civilian populations. Farmers increased production of wheat, corn, soybeans, and other crops essential for feeding America and its allies. Victory gardens appeared in backyards and empty lots throughout Ohio's cities, encouraging civilians to grow their own vegetables and reduce pressure on commercial food supplies. The state's transportation infrastructure proved vital for moving materials and personnel needed for the war effort. Ohio's railroads carried enormous amounts of coal, steel, and manufactured goods to ports on the east and west coasts. The Great Lakes shipping system moved iron ore from Minnesota to Ohio's steel mills and carried finished products to other parts of the country. Highways built during the New Deal made truck transportation easier, adding to rail and water shipping. Ohio's role in military training was just as important. Many army bases, airfields, and naval facilities were set up or expanded throughout the state. Camp Peary near Port Clinton became a major training center for military personnel, while Wright Field in Dayton trained pilots and aviation mechanics. These facilities brought thousands of service members to Ohio, many of whom would return after the war to settle permanently in communities they had discovered during their military service. The psychological impact of the war on Ohio communities was deep. Almost every family had relatives or friends serving in the military, creating bonds between the home front and the fighting fronts that made the conflict intensely personal. Gold stars appeared in windows throughout Ohio, marking homes where family members had made the ultimate sacrifice. Community groups rallied to support the war effort through bond drives, scrap metal collections, and care packages for overseas troops. Rationing affected every part of daily life in Ohio during the war. Gasoline, rubber tires, Meat, sugar, and many other goods were divided according to government priorities that put military needs first. Civilians learned to cope with shortages by sharing resources, finding substitutes for unavailable products, and accepting limits on their use that would have been unthinkable during peacetime. The war also brought technological innovations that would have lasting effects on Ohio's economy. Radar development at Wright Field led to advances in electronics that would prove valuable in peacetime uses. Chemical companies developed new materials and processes for military uses that could later be adapted for civilian markets. Medical research supported by military contracts improved treatments and procedures that would benefit civilian healthcare. Research and development activities expanded dramatically during the war as government, industry, and universities worked together on projects essential to military success. Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland, the University of Cincinnati, and Ohio State University all took part in defense research programs. These partnerships set patterns of cooperation between academic and industrial research that would continue after the war ended. The end of the war in 1945 brought both celebration and worry to Ohio. Communities were happy at the return of peace and the homecoming of military personnel, but there were also concerns about whether the economy could keep full employment without military contracts. The memories of the Great Depression were still fresh, and many people worried that the end of wartime production might lead to another economic collapse. However, the change from wartime to peacetime production went more smoothly than many had feared. People's desire for consumer goods that had been unavailable during the war created markets for Ohio's industrial output. Returning veterans used GI Bill benefits to buy homes and automobiles, encouraging construction and manufacturing industries. The suburbs that had begun developing before the war expanded quickly as families sought new housing outside crowded urban centers. The post-war boom changed Ohio's landscape in basic ways. Suburban communities grew up around major cities, connected by new highways that made commuting practical for middle-class families. Shopping centers replaced downtown business districts as the main shopping places for many communities. Drive-in restaurants, movie theaters, and other businesses adapted to the car-oriented lifestyle that marked post-war America. Veterans returning from overseas service brought new views and expectations that influenced Ohio's social and cultural development. Many had seen different ways of life during their military service and were less willing to accept traditional limits and restrictions. The GI Bill gave educational opportunities that allowed veterans to pursue careers that would have been impossible without government help. This investment in human capital paid huge rewards for Ohio's economy and society. Women who had entered the workforce during the war faced difficult choices about their post-war roles. Many were pressured to give up their jobs to returning veterans, showing traditional ideas about gender roles and family responsibilities. Yet the wartime experience had shown women's abilities in jobs once held by men, creating expectations and hopes that could not easily be pushed aside. The tension between traditional roles and new possibilities would influence gender relations for decades to come. African Americans who had found new opportunities during the war were similarly unwilling to accept pre-war limits on their progress. Military service had given experiences of greater equality, while wartime jobs had shown their abilities in skilled occupations. The contradiction between fighting for democracy overseas while accepting segregation at home became increasingly hard to accept. The civil rights movement that would change American society during the 1950s and 1960s had important roots in Ohio's wartime experiences. The state's industrial cities had attracted large numbers of African American migrants, creating communities with the numbers and resources needed to challenge unfair practices. The success of African American workers in wartime industries gave proof that racial barriers were artificial rather than natural limits. Labor unions came out of the war in strong positions, having shown their patriotism while also protecting workers' interests. The cooperation between labor and management that had marked the war years created expectations for continued teamwork in addressing post-war challenges. However, the end of wartime price controls and production limits also created new sources of conflict, as both workers and employers adjusted to peacetime conditions. The strike wave of 1946 affected many Ohio industries, as workers sought to keep the gains they had made during the war while adjusting to post-war economic conditions. Steel workers, automobile workers, and workers in other major industries took part in work stoppages that sometimes lasted for weeks. These conflicts showed the growing pains of an economy changing from war to peace, but they were generally settled through negotiation rather than violence. Ohio's political landscape was also changed by the war experience. Veterans returning from overseas brought new views on America's role in world affairs, making Ohio voters more open to international involvement. The isolationist feeling that had marked much of the state's politics before the war gave way to acceptance of America's duties as a global superpower. This shift would influence Ohio's representation in Congress and its approach to foreign policy issues. The development of nuclear weapons during the war, though Ohio was not directly involved in their production, raised questions about technology and warfare that would affect the state's defense industries. The coming of the atomic age created new demands for scientific research and technological development that would benefit Ohio's universities and high-tech industries. The Cold War that came after 1945 would keep military spending that continued to support Ohio's economy. By 1950, Ohio had successfully changed from a wartime to a peacetime economy, while keeping the prosperity that had begun during the war. The state's population had grown to more than 7 million, with major increases in both urban and suburban areas. Industrial production had reached new peaks while farm output had also increased to meet growing demand. The foundation had been laid for the steady economic growth that would mark the 1950s and early 1960s. The war had also strengthened Ohio's position as a key swing state in American politics. The state's electoral votes had been essential to Roosevelt's wartime victories, while its diverse economy and population made it a small-scale model of national trends. Politicians who could succeed in Ohio showed broad appeal that worked well in national campaigns, continuing the state's tradition of producing influential political leaders. Perhaps, most importantly, the war had shown Ohio's strength and ability to adapt in the face of never-before-seen challenges. The state's ability to gather its resources for the war effort while also keeping civilian morale and social unity proved that the lessons learned during the Great Depression had been well taken in. Ohio had come out of the war not only victorious but also stronger and more confident in its ability to meet future challenges. The 50s. The 1950s brought never-before-seen prosperity to Ohio as the state benefited from the steady economic growth that marked post-war America. The combination of strong industrial production, growing consumer demand, and federal investments in infrastructure created opportunities for progress that seemed to fulfill the American dream for growing numbers of Ohio families. Yet beneath this surface prosperity, social and economic changes were happening that would eventually challenge many ideas about Ohio's future. The suburban boom changed Ohio's landscape during the 1950s as middle-class families left older city neighborhoods for new communities on the edges of major cities. Levittown-style developments grew up around Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, and other urban centers, offering modern homes with yards, garages, and all the extras that meant post-war wealth. These suburban communities were connected to city job centers by new highways that made commuting practical for office workers. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 had particular meaning for Ohio, as the state's location made it a key crossing point for the new interstate highway system. Interstate 2 running east-west across the state, and Interstate 75, running north-south, crossed near Dayton, making Ohio a major hub for national transportation. These highways not only made suburban development easier, but also attracted new industries and distribution centers that valued Ohio's central location and transportation connections. Ohio's manufacturing sector continued to do well during the 1950s, with steel production reaching new peaks and the automobile industry creating huge demand for Ohio-made parts. The state's rubber industry adapted successfully to peacetime markets, producing tires for the millions of automobiles being bought by American families. New industries, particularly in chemicals and electronics, set up operations in Ohio to take advantage of the state's skilled workforce and transportation infrastructure. The prosperity of the 1950s created new opportunities for Ohio's working families. Real wages increased steadily throughout the decade, allowing families to buy homes, automobiles, and household appliances that had been luxuries for earlier generations. The 40-hour workweek became standard in most industries, giving free time that could be spent on family activities and personal interests. Paid vacations allowed Ohio families to travel and enjoy recreation opportunities throughout the region. Consumer culture flourished in Ohio during the 1950s as shopping centers and department stores offered a never-before-seen variety of goods and services. Downtown business districts in major cities expanded to handle growing demand, while new suburban shopping centers served the needs of families in outlying communities. Television advertising, broadcast from stations in Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus, created awareness of new products and services, while also reinforcing cultural values and expectations. The baby boom that marked the post-war period had major effects on Ohio communities. School enrollment increased dramatically, requiring new buildings and more teachers to serve growing student populations. Suburban communities that had been built for young families found themselves needing to develop educational, recreational, and cultural facilities to meet their residents' needs. The expansion of higher education sped up as college enrollment grew and new programs were set up to meet changing economic demands. Ohio State University expanded significantly during the 1950s, growing into one of the nation's largest and most complete universities. The institution's research programs, particularly in farming, engineering, and medicine, added to the state's economic development while also training the skilled professionals needed by growing industries. Similar expansion happened at other Ohio universities, including Case Institute of Technology, the University of Cincinnati, and Miami University. The GI Bill continued to give educational opportunities to veterans throughout the 1950s, adding to the growth of Ohio's colleges and universities. Many veterans who might never have attended college were able to seek higher education, leading to more social mobility and the expansion of professional and managerial jobs. This investment in human skills would prove crucial to Ohio's continued economic development as the economy became more technologically advanced. Cultural life in Ohio during the 1950s showed both national trends and special regional qualities. The Cleveland Orchestra, under the direction of George Schell, achieved international recognition for its artistic excellence. The Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra and Columbus Symphony also gained attention, while smaller cities developed their own cultural institutions. Museums, theaters, and libraries expanded to serve growing and increasingly educated populations. Sports remained important sources of community, identity, and pride throughout Ohio. The Cleveland Browns, Cincinnati Reds, and other professional teams gave focal points for regional loyalty and civic pride. High school football became particularly important in smaller communities where Friday night games served as major social events that brought together people from all parts of the community. College sports, particularly Ohio State football, created statewide excitement that went beyond regional boundaries. The civil rights movement began to gain energy in Ohio during the 1950s, challenging separation and discrimination that had limited opportunities for African Americans. Despite the state's free state heritage, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education affected Ohio school districts, many of which had kept separation in practice despite official policies of integration. Civil rights groups in Cleveland, Cincinnati, and other cities organized campaigns to end discrimination in jobs, housing, and public places. Ohio's African American communities had grown substantially during and after World War II, creating the numbers needed to challenge unfair practices effectively. The success of African American workers in wartime industries had shown their abilities, while military service had given experiences of greater equality that made post-war discrimination harder to accept. Churches, labor unions, and civil rights groups gave organizational basis for organizing civil rights campaigns. The Montgomery bus boycott and other civil rights actions in the South received strong support from Ohio's African American communities, who organized fundraising campaigns and gave other help to Southern civil rights workers. This solidarity showed the understanding that civil rights was a national rather than regional issue and that progress in the South would benefit African Americans. Throughout the country, women's roles in 1950s. Ohio showed the tensions between traditional expectations and the new possibilities that had come out of World War II. Many women, who had worked in defense plants during the war, returned to domestic roles after 1945, showing both social pressures and their own desires to focus on family life after years of separation and sacrifice. Yet, the experience of wartime jobs had shown abilities that could not be easily forgotten. The suburban lifestyle that marked 1950s Ohio was built around ideas about traditional gender roles, with men commuting to jobs in the city, while women managed households and raised children in suburban communities. This pattern worked well for many families and showed genuine choices about how to organize domestic life. However, it also created isolation and frustration for some women who sought more opportunities for personal fulfillment and career progress. The rise of television as a main form of entertainment had particular meaning for Ohio, as the state became an important center for television production and broadcasting. WLWT in Cincinnati and other Ohio stations started programming formats that would influence national television development. Local television personalities became regional celebrities, while national programs broadcast from Ohio reached audiences throughout the Midwest. Television also reinforced cultural trends toward sameness and national integration that were changing Ohio communities. Local traditions and regional differences became less distinct as families throughout Ohio watched the same programs and absorbed the same cultural messages. This sameness had both good and bad effects, reducing narrow local views, while also lessening the cultural variety that had once marked different parts of the state. Religious life in Ohio during the 1950s showed both traditional patterns and new developments. Mainline Protestant churches continued to serve established communities, while Catholic churches expanded to serve growing immigrant populations. The suburban boom led to much church building, as new communities sought to set up religious institutions. Cooperation between different faiths increased as communities worked together on social and civic projects. The Cold War had major effects on Ohio throughout the 1950s as the state's defense industries adapted to the needs of nuclear-age warfare. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton became a major center for aerospace research and development, while defense contractors throughout Ohio worked on projects related to missiles, electronics, and nuclear technology. The space race that began with the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 created new opportunities for Ohio's high-technology industries. Fear of communism influenced Ohio politics and social life throughout the decade, as McCarthyism and other anti-communist movements gained support in some communities. Labor unions, universities, and other institutions faced pressure to show their loyalty and opposition to communist influence. These pressures sometimes held back honest political debate and academic freedom, showing the worries that came with America's rise as a global superpower. Yet Ohio's democratic traditions generally proved strong in the face of these pressures. The state's competitive political system encouraged debate and discussion of public issues, while its ethnic and religious variety created groups that valued tolerance and variety. Schools kept their commitments to academic freedom despite outside pressures, while labor unions defended their members against unfair accusations and mistreatment. By the end of the 1950s, Ohio appeared to be doing well as never before. Industrial production continued to grow, unemployment remained low, and living standards reached new heights for most of the state's residents. The suburban communities that had grown up around major cities seemed to show the fulfillment of American dreams about prosperity, movement, and opportunity. Schools and cultural institutions had expanded to serve growing populations, while transportation and communication infrastructure connected Ohio more closely to national markets and networks. Yet careful observers could see signs of challenges that would become more obvious in later decades. Ohio's industrial base was beginning to show signs of age, with some facilities becoming outdated compared to newer plants in other regions or countries. The movement of African Americans from the South was creating city populations that strained housing and social services, while also causing racial tensions. The suburban development that marked a decade was creating new forms of social separation based on income and race. The prosperity of the 1950s had also created expectations about continued growth and opportunity that would prove hard to keep up in later decades. Ohio's workers, businesses, and communities had become used to steady increases in living standards and economic opportunity. When these trends began to reverse in the 1960s and 1970s, the adjustments would prove more difficult because of the high expectations that had been created during the post-war boom. Despite these growing challenges, the 1950s represented a crucial period of growth and development that set foundations for Ohio's modern economy and society. The investments in education, infrastructure, and technology made during this decade would give resources for addressing future challenges. The social and cultural changes that happened during the 1950s, while sometimes creating tensions, also expanded opportunities and possibilities for Ohio's diverse population. The decade had shown both Ohio's potential and its weak spots as it prepared to face the more troubled years that lay ahead. The 1960s brought turmoil and change to Ohio that challenged many ideas about the state's future direction. The civil rights movement, anti-war protests, city unrest, and economic changes that marked the decade forced Ohioans to face difficult questions about equality, opportunity, and the kind of society they wanted to create. The hope and prosperity of the 1950s gave way to a more complex and uncertain era that tested the state's strength and ability to adapt. The civil rights movement reached Ohio with particular force during the early 1960s, as African American communities organized campaigns to end discrimination in jobs, housing, and education. The lunch counter sit-ins that began in the South inspired similar actions in Ohio cities where protesters challenged separated restaurants, hotels, and other public places. Though Ohio had never legally required separation, unfair practices had created patterns of separation that were sometimes as strict as those found in the South. Cleveland became a major center of civil rights activity, with groups like the Congress of Racial Equality and the NAACP organizing protests and voter registration campaigns. The building of new housing projects and city renewal programs became particular sources of conflict, as many African Americans believed these efforts were designed to keep racial separation rather than encourage integration. The concentration of African Americans in certain neighborhoods and school districts made it hard to achieve the integration that civil rights leaders demanded. The murder of President John F. Kennedy in November 1963 shocked Ohio communities just as it did the rest of the nation. Kennedy had been popular in Ohio, having carried the state in the 1960 election, and his death was mourned throughout the state. The violent end to his presidency seemed to symbolize the loss of innocence that marked the early 1960s, as Americans began to face the limits of their society's progress toward justice and equality. The escalation of the Vietnam War during the mid-1960s had deep effects on Ohio, as young men from throughout the state were drafted for military service. The state's universities became centers of anti-war protest, with students at Ohio State, Kent State, and other campuses organizing demonstrations and teach-ins to oppose American involvement in Southeast Asia. These protests showed growing doubts about the war's purpose and conduct, as well as broader questioning of authority that marked the decade. The anti-war movement in Ohio gained energy as deaths mounted and the draft affected growing numbers of young men. Teach-ins at universities gave places for debating the war's merits, while protest marches in major cities showed growing opposition to American policy. The burning of draft cards and other acts of resistance showed the strength of feeling among war opponents. Those supporters of the war also organized counter-demonstrations and rallies. Economic changes during the 1960s began to show weak spots in Ohio's industrial base that had not been obvious during the prosperous 1950s. Foreign competition, particularly from Japan and Germany, began to challenge American manufacturers in steel, automobiles, and other industries that were crucial to Ohio's economy. Technological changes reduced the need for workers in some traditional industries, while new industries often located in other regions where labor costs were lower. The decline of Ohio's steel industry became particularly obvious during the 1960s, as newer, more efficient plants in other countries began to take more market share. Cleveland's steel mills, which had been among the most productive in the world during World War II, found themselves unable to compete with foreign producers who used more modern technology and paid lower wages. Plant closings and layoffs began to affect communities that had depended on steel production for decades. City unrest broke out in several Ohio cities during the mid-1960s, showing frustrations that had been building in African American communities for decades. The Hawk riots in Cleveland during July 1966 were among the most serious, lasting for 6 days and resulting in 4 deaths and millions of dollars in property damage. These disturbances showed anger about unemployment, poor housing, police brutality, and limited chances for progress. The Hawk riots shocked Cleveland's white community, many of whom had believed that the city's race relations were better than those found in southern cities. The violence showed deep problems that had been largely invisible to white residents, including the concentration of poverty in certain neighborhoods and the limited success of traditional civil rights strategies in addressing economic inequality. Similar unrest happened in Cincinnati, Akron, and other Ohio cities, as African American communities showed their frustrations with the slow pace of change, despite civil rights laws. The riots were both signs of underlying problems and triggers for new approaches to addressing city poverty and racial inequality. Federal programs like the War on Poverty began to send resources to war-affected communities, though with mixed results. The murder of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. in April 1968 caused more unrest in Ohio cities as African Americans mourned the loss of the civil rights movement's most prominent leader. The violence that followed King's death showed not only grief but also anger about the continued presence of discrimination and inequality despite years of civil rights activism. The destruction of businesses and property in African American neighborhoods often hurt the very communities that protesters sought to help. Student protests reached the peak at Kent State University on May 4, 1970, when Ohio National Guard troops opened fire on demonstrators, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. The Kent State shootings shocked the nation and became symbols of the divisions that were tearing American society apart over the Vietnam War. The deaths of Jeffrey Miller, Allison Krause, William Schroeder, and Sandra Schuer brought together anti-war feeling throughout the country. The Kent State tragedy showed the intense division that marked Ohio and the nation during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Supporters of the war viewed student protesters as unpatriotic troublemakers who deserved harsh treatment, while opponents saw them as patriotic Americans, using their constitutional rights to disagree. The use of deadly force against unarmed students crossed a line that many Americans found unacceptable, regardless of their views on the war. The investigation that followed the Kent State shootings showed failures of leadership and communication that had added to the tragedy. The decision to call in the National Guard, the rules about using force that guided the troops' actions, and the increase of tensions over several days all added to the deadly result. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and controversial, with conflicting accounts of what had actually happened and why. Environmental concerns began to appear during the 1960s as Ohioans became increasingly aware of the pollution that came with industrial development. The Cuyahoga River, which flows through Cleveland and had been polluted by industrial waste for decades, actually caught fire in June 1969, creating a dramatic symbol of environmental damage. Though the fire was small and quickly put out, photographs of the burning river became famous images that helped start the environmental movement. Lake Erie's decline became another symbol of environmental problems as pollution from industrial sources and farm runoff created conditions that threatened fish populations and made the lake unfit for swimming in many areas. The lake was called dead by some observers, though this description was exaggerated. Efforts to clean up Lake Erie began during the late 1960s and would continue for decades. The women's liberation movement gained energy in Ohio during the late 1960s as women organized to challenge discrimination and expand opportunities for education and jobs. Consciousness-raising groups met in cities throughout the state, while groups like the National Organization for Women set up chapters that worked for equal rights and opportunities. These activities showed growing dissatisfaction with traditional gender roles and expectations. Ohio women took part in the broader national movement for gender equality, organizing protests, working for legal changes, and challenging unfair practices in jobs and education. The struggle for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment became a particular focus during the 1970s, though it was finally unsuccessful. Title X, which banned sex discrimination in education, had major effects on Ohio schools and universities. Cultural changes during the 1960s were as dramatic as political developments as Ohio communities dealt with changing attitudes about authority, tradition, and social rules. The rise of rock and roll music, the growth of youth culture, and changing attitudes about sexuality and drug use created conflicts between generations that affected families and communities throughout the state. Traditional institutions like churches and schools struggled to adapt to rapidly changing expectations and behaviors. The counterculture movement found expression in Ohio through the growth of communes, alternative newspapers, and underground music scenes. Cities like Cleveland and Cincinnati developed lively music scenes that showed the broader cultural changes happening throughout the country. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame would eventually be located in Cleveland, showing the city's important role in the development of popular music. By the end of the 1960s, Ohio had been changed by the social and political upheavals that had marked the decade. The hope and agreement that had marked the 1950s had given way to division and uncertainty about the state's future direction. Yet the decade had also shown the strength of democratic institutions and the ability of Ohio's people to face difficult challenges through peaceful political processes. The civil rights movement had achieved important legal victories and had opened new opportunities for African Americans. Though economic inequality and residential separation remained lasting problems, the anti-war movement had helped change American policy toward Vietnam. Though at the cost of social division and political division, the environmental movement had raised awareness of pollution problems and had begun to create support for cleanup efforts. Most importantly, the 1960s had set new expectations about citizen participation in democratic government and social change. The decade had shown that ordinary people could organize effectively to challenge established policies and institutions, creating possibilities for continued reform and adaptation. These lessons would prove valuable as Ohio faced the economic challenges and social changes that would mark the following decades. Challenges and changes. The 1970s opened, with Ohio still recovering from the upheavals of the previous decade. But new challenges were emerging that would test the state's economic foundations in ways not experienced since the Great Depression. The industrial strength that had supported Ohio's prosperity for more than a century began to show serious signs of weakness as foreign competition, technological change, and shifting market conditions combined to weaken traditional manufacturing industries. The energy crises of 1973 and 1979 had particular meaning for Ohio's economy, as the state's energy-intensive industries faced dramatically higher costs for oil and natural gas. Steel mills, chemical plants, and other major employers found their operating costs rising faster than their income, forcing them to consider plant closings and layoffs that would have been unthinkable during the prosperous decades following World War II. The quadrupling of oil prices during the 1970s made many Ohio industrial facilities unable to compete compared to newer plants in other regions or countries. The industrialization became a harsh reality for many Ohio communities during the 1970s as plant closings and layoffs affected cities that had depended on manufacturing for generations. Youngstown's steel industry, which had employed tens of thousands of workers and supported the regional economy, began a decline that would continue for decades. The announcement of major layoffs at steel plants sent shockwaves through communities where steel working had been passed down from father to son for generations. The automobile industry, which had been crucial to Ohio's prosperity throughout the 20th century, also faced serious challenges during the 1970s. Foreign competition, particularly from Japanese manufacturers, began to take significant market share by offering more fuel-efficient and reliable vehicles than American producers. Ohio's parts suppliers and assembly plants found themselves open to these changes as domestic automakers cut production and closed facilities. Akron's rubber industry had similar difficulties as tire manufacturers faced competition from foreign producers, and changes in tire technology that reduced demand for traditional products. The city that had once been linked with American tire production found itself struggling to keep its industrial base as companies moved production to lower-cost regions or closed facilities altogether. Cleveland became a symbol of city decline during the 1970s, as the city's population fell from more than 750,000 in 1950 to fewer than 575,000 by 1980. The loss of manufacturing jobs, combined with suburban growth that drew middle-class families away from the city center, created a downward spiral that was hard to reverse. Empty lots and abandoned buildings became common sights in neighborhoods that had once been thriving communities. The city financial crisis that ended in Cleveland's default in December 1978 showed the money challenges facing many Ohio cities during this period. Cleveland became the first major American city to fail to pay its debt obligations since the Great Depression, creating national attention and shame for a community that had once been among America's most prosperous. The default was both a sign of deeper economic problems and a trigger for reform efforts. Dennis Kucinich, Cleveland's young mayor during the default crisis, became a controversial figure whose approach to city government showed broader tensions about how to address city decline. His fights with local banks and utility companies connected with working-class voters who felt left behind by traditional political and business leaders. But his confrontational style also made it harder to address the city's financial problems. Rural Ohio also faced challenges during the 1970s as farm economics became increasingly difficult. The farm crisis that would reach its peak in the 1980s had its roots in developments during the 1970s as farmers borrowed heavily to expand their operations and buy new equipment, only to find themselves unable to pay their debts. When crop prices fell and interest rates rose, family farms that had been worked for generations were lost to foreclosure or forced sale. The energy crisis of the 1970s had mixed effects on Ohio's farming, increasing the costs of fuel and fertilizer while also creating new markets for corn that could be turned into ethanol fuel. Some Ohio farmers benefited from higher crop prices during periods of energy shortage, but the ups and downs of energy markets made it hard to plan for long-term investment and development. Environmental issues became increasingly prominent in Ohio during the 1970s as federal laws like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act required major improvements in pollution control. Ohio's industrial facilities faced expensive changes to reduce air and water pollution, costs that often made older plants uneconomical to run. The environmental movement that had been started by events like the Cuyahoga River fire began to achieve real results in the form of cleaner air and water. The cleanup of Lake Erie became a particular focus during the 1970s as international cooperation between the United States and Canada led to major improvements in water quality. The reduction of phosphorus pollution from industrial sources and city sewage treatment plants allowed fish populations to recover and made the lake fit for swimming again. This success showed that environmental problems could be addressed through coordinated action, though often at considerable cost. The 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in Pennsylvania in March 1979 had major effects on Ohio's energy policies and public attitudes toward nuclear power. Ohio had been developing nuclear power plants as alternatives to fossil fuels. But the accident raised serious questions about the safety and economics of nuclear energy. Public opposition to nuclear power increased dramatically, making it harder to develop alternative energy sources. Higher education in Ohio went through major changes during the 1970s as universities adapted to new student populations and changing social expectations. The expansion of community colleges gave more accessible higher education opportunities, while traditional four-year institutions developed new programs to serve working adults and other non-traditional students. The integration of previously all-white institutions continued, though often with considerable difficulty and controversy. Kent State University worked to rebuild its reputation and restore normal campus life after the tragic shootings of 1970. But the events of that May Day continued to influence the institution and the broader community. Memorial services and commemorations became yearly reminders of the costs of political division and the importance of peaceful resolution of conflicts. The university's efforts to address its past while moving forward showed broader challenges facing American institutions during this period. Women's roles in Ohio continued to change during the 1970s as the women's liberation movement gained energy and legal barriers to equality were removed. Title Ikes opened new opportunities for women in education and athletics, while affirmative action programs sought to address historical discrimination in jobs. The first women began entering jobs once held mostly by men, like law, medicine, and engineering, in significant numbers. The struggle over the equal rights amendment became a particular focus of women's rights activism in Ohio during the 1970s. Though the amendment was never approved, the debate over gender equality raised awareness of discrimination and helped build support for legal solutions. The growth of women's organizations and support networks gave organizational basis for continued activism and advocacy. African Americans in Ohio faced continued challenges during the 1970s, despite the legal victories of the civil rights movement. Residential separation remained common in many cities, while economic opportunities were limited by discrimination and the decline of industries that had provided jobs. The growth of African American political representation gave some hope for change as more African Americans were elected to city councils, state legislatures, and other offices. Carl Stokes's election as mayor of Cleveland in 1967 had made him one of the first African Americans to lead a major American city, and his success inspired other African American candidates throughout Ohio. However, the economic challenges facing cities like Cleveland made it hard for African American political leaders to deliver the improvements their constituents needed and deserved. The busing controversies that affected many American cities during the 1970s had particular meaning in Ohio, where several school districts were ordered to carry out desegregation plans that included transporting students across neighborhood boundaries. These plans were often controversial, causing protests from parents who preferred neighborhood schools and raising questions about the most effective ways to achieve educational equality. Labor unions in Ohio faced their most serious challenges since the 1930 SCA's deindustrialization reduced membership and weakened their bargaining power. The steelworkers, auto workers, and other industrial unions that had been central to Ohio's economy found themselves fighting defensive battles to preserve jobs and benefits rather than winning new gains. The decline of union membership would have long-term effects on Ohio's politics and economy. Cultural life in Ohio during the 1970s showed both the challenges facing the state and efforts to keep community identity and pride despite economic difficulties. The Cleveland Orchestra continued to perform at the highest artistic levels, while new cultural institutions like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame began to develop. Sports remained important sources of community pride, though team success on the field could not make up for broader economic problems. The 1970s ended with Ohio facing an uncertain future as traditional industries continued to decline, and new economic opportunities remained unclear. The state's population growth had slowed significantly compared to the boom decades following World War II, while some areas actually lost population as people moved to regions with better economic prospects. Yet Ohio's strong educational institutions, central location, and varied economy gave foundations for eventual recovery and renewal. The challenges of the 1970s had tested Ohio's strength and ability to adapt in ways not experienced for decades. Communities that had prospered during the industrial age found themselves forced to reinvent their economic bases and social institutions. The process was often painful and divisive, but it also showed the ability of Ohio's people to face difficult circumstances with determination and creativity.